I should also say, yes, I'm Anne. I'm a white woman of a certain age, sitting in my living room with long hair and glasses, and I'll invite my colleagues to introduce themselves in the same way for the sake of the recording, anyone there for whom that's useful. Right. Well, without more ado, I'm going to dive into the content today, and it's lovely to see you all. Thank you for introducing yourselves. Great. Sorry, I hope you can see me as well. It's there's quite a few screens, but hopefully we'll have some time to talk to each other later on. So what are we going to do today? So this is a version of a workshop that over the years we've done quite a few times, but actually this is a slightly more expanded version of it, and as well as hopefully imparting some useful information, hosting some useful conversation, because I think many of you in this conversation have much to say to each other as well. We're also hoping that we can use some of the content to share some of the tips and suggestions that we have further afield. So I'm going to do a quick introduction just so you know who the hell it is that's talking to you. I'm then going to hand over to some of my colleagues in the research team who work a lot with organisations to do a bit of, you can relax. They're going to talk us through a very, very simple step-by-step, thinking about some of the science and people issues related to doing quantitative research and surveying. We're then hoping that you will have the energy to stay with us and have some discussion of some of the real world challenges that you have. We'd really like to hear from you about that and to formulate some questions for a panel discussion later on. We're going to be having a break around about 2:30. Have about 10-15 minute break at that point, and then I'm delighted to say we're going to welcome 3 guests from museums of different sizes, although if you're not from a museum, don't worry, we'll be thinking about how their experience transposes to your situation. Thank you very much, all 3 of you coming along to do that. And then we'll have a panel discussion. So the FAQs that you've unearthed in the discussion section, hopefully we'll be addressing some of those and anything else we want to talk about. And then finally, we'd just like to get some of your input about what other kinds of resources and information will be useful to help you in your surveying endeavours in the future. So that's our course today. We will definitely be finishing by 4:30. You never know, if you're lucky, we might finish earlier than that. So welcome. And without more ado, I'm just going to give you a very quick introduction to what we're doing here today. Just in case you don't know, as your hosts, we are the audience agency. I guess most of you will do, but just in case not, we are a non-profit UK charity. We like to think of ourselves as being the UK charity for cultural engagement and participation, supporting organisations in their endeavours to do that. So basically, we end up doing a lot of audience, visitor, public and sector research, as well as policy research, lots and lots of analysis of audiences. That includes doing surveying with, I've estimated, around about 1,000 organisations a year. In the UK and far beyond as well. We run something called Audience Finder, which I'm just going to explain very briefly in a moment. And we also run a big population study, which is continuing at the moment, we call the Cultural Participation Monitor. And we hold these really important national data sets telling us about who our audiences are, and of course, by implication, who they're not. We are funded to do that by Arts Council England, Creative Scotland and Arts Council Wales. As an organisation, though, I guess what we're really interested in is we're interested in making sure that the cultural and creative riches of the nation are fully available to as many people as possible. So we're very interested in the business of engagement and participation, and we like to work with organisations who are out there thinking of new ways of bringing audiences in and engaging with participants. We place a lot of emphasis on collaboration, working together to share data and knowledge, and I guess today is all about that. So that's us. Oh, that's also us. We're also a bunch of nice people. I guess that's my point. It's slightly sadly, quite a lot of people there have gone and we miss them, but we haven't all got together for such a long time. We haven't got any new photos, but we are about 50 people inside the organisation, and we have there's also some photos of our networks there because we also work with lots of people outside our organisation as well. So, you know, we're nice people. Talk to us. There's lots of different ways you can, and there's the link to do that. Okay. I will just say, I know some of you will definitely be Audience Finder users and know all about Audience Finder and what it is and what it does. But just in case you don't, and for some of you who are joining us to talk about surveying beyond the narrow confines of Audience Finder, I just want to very quickly explain that some people here will be working with us on their audience finder surveys. And so some questions are likely to come up about that. I'll just explain very, very briefly. The audience finder is a collaborative data analysis and support service. So essentially, we enable about 800 organisations across the UK to collect data in 2 standardised ways, and one of them is surveying in such a way that means that we can put together a much bigger picture of audiences, understand the differences between us, be able to compare one audience in one place, one venue, several organisations, with the comparators, or indeed with the population. What we have, in fact, is a database of all UK households, and we tag into that to tell us when people have bought a ticket somewhere, or indeed when they've done a survey. So we really understand, it helps to build a picture of cultural engagement across the nation. As I say, it has data from about 800 organisations, arts, museums, and many, many other different ones besides. It's funded by those 3 agencies, and it's free for anybody, whether you're funded or not, to put your audience data into and have all the benefits of the metrics and so on that come out of it. As I say, one of the most important aspects of Audience Finder is that it tells us all those things, who our audience is, blah, blah. But importantly, it also has the Audience Finder survey within it. So the survey is quite a simple idea, a standardized survey. We ask people to collect a representative sample of their audience across a year in order that we're able to look at what different audiences look like, particularly around demographics, behaviours and opinions, across, in a standard way across lots of organisations. So as I say, hundreds of organisations do the Audience Finder survey. We ask them to do a minimum size sample across the course of the year, and I think it is 384, Dan? I think it is.
Maybe we'll find out later.
Maybe we'll find out later.
Maybe it's 10, maybe it's 100, maybe it's 1,000.
An important question indeed. So as I say, not all of you here will be Audience Finder survey users, but I just wanted to acknowledge that that is sitting behind some of the things we're talking about today. It's not the only thing we're talking about by a long way. In fact, we want to just talk about surveying in a much broader, wider sense, and why it's important to us as organisations who want to hear what our users have to say to us. So really, what lies behind Respect, why making audiences' views matter, our workshop today? So really, we want to talk about the really practical things to do with when and how to use quantitative research. We're talking very specifically about quantitative surveying today. We want to talk about how we do that well operationally so that we can make reliable decisions on the basis of, so we can use it as a reliable source of information on which to make good decisions. But we want to talk about why surveying is more important than just bean counting. It's not just a hygiene factor. It isn't something that we can and should do just to keep our various stakeholders happy. We want to talk about how important it is in terms of us understanding what really makes our stakeholders, our communities, and our users tick, what they think of us, how we can do things better. How do we, surveying is the really important source of information by which most of us understand what our broader user groups think about what we do. So how do we make sure that we do our survey in such a way that we can really make people's views matter and count in the way that we work as organisations? For many of us, it's the main way in which we get to know our audiences. It's often the first, perhaps one-to-one, two-way contact that many people will ever have with us. More and more people book their tickets online, or they make their arrangements online. Mostly, it's perhaps the only way that you'll ever talk to many of your audience or visitors, your audience members or visitors. So the way we survey massively affects our brand and perceptions of the organisation. It affects how welcome people feel. It affects their sense of who you are welcoming as an organisation. If we do our surveying right, we can really challenge our assumptions. What do people really think of us? What do they really want us to be doing? Who's really coming? Who's not coming, and why not? It can really, even straightforward, simple surveying in organisations can help us to answer all of those questions, challenge what we thought we knew, and help us to adapt our approach in more user-friendly, audience and visitor-friendly ways. And I think all the practical tips and things we're going to be talking about today are really about helping us to do that. And doing surveys well can help us to do exactly that. If we do them badly, they can, of course, end up just wasting a lot of people's time, reinforcing some of the biases and ideas that we have, and not helping us to move on and make audience-centered change. So I guess we're saying that, of course, it's important to do your research well for obvious hygiene reasons, but it's much more fundamental than that. And we're really interested in talking about how we do it so that it makes us more audience or visitor focused in the way that we work. I'm just going to share with you that there's very disturbing things just happened outside my house. Some men with some very big bits of machinery have just started digging a hole directly outside, and I have a horrible feeling they're about to employ a large drill. So if that happens and I turn my screen off, I may just have to hand over to a colleague. But anyway, now is my moment where I'm going to hand over to a colleague anyway. So hopefully nothing bad will happen as a result of that. So I am now going to hand over to my colleagues, Dan, Rimi and Zoe, to talk us through some of the really practical issues to do with quantitative research in terms of people, process and method. So sit back and let it wash over you, and hopefully you'll have some questions at the end of it. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, hey everyone. I'm Dan. I'm the research manager on the quantitative side of the audience agency, and I'm currently sat here in slightly drizzly London, and I'm in the 35 to 44 age bracket, white British, cisgendered male. Currently wearing glasses, not essential, but I imagine I'll keep them on for the next hour. Thanks for looking at the screen. Okay, so.
Anne, would you close your presentation and then Dan will bring it up?
Okay. Adam, how's this? Are the slides moving?
Oh yeah, that's worked.
Brilliant. Awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit about research in its broadest sense, and yeah, a bit about kind of the fundamentals, what you need to know, maybe some pearls of wisdom that I picked up over the years about research. So for me, I think there are, let's say, 4 pillars of successful research. There could be 3, there could be 10, but let's pretend there are 4. If we had to group it down to 4, then first up, I think understanding the fundamentals is really important. So you don't need to be an expert to do research, but it's worth understanding the fundamentals of how quantitative research works, so you can be sure that the data you're collecting is actually going to be useful and is going to represent the audience accurately, and therefore that you can actually use it. So getting those fundamentals in place, very important. Secondly, planning. So making sure that when you're doing research, that before you go ahead and do it, that you've planned it out and done everything you can to make sure that it's going to work. So that includes things like making sure the tools are designed correctly, but also thinking about things like how to get buy-in from your organization, and thinking about how your audience will actually experience the research, and making sure that you do everything that you can in the planning stage to make sure that the people you're talking to and that are talking to you have a good experience of it. The third pillar is about training. So making sure that you or your staff or whoever's going to be involved in actually collecting data, collecting feedback from audience members, is able to do so effectively in a way that does actually represent that audience's voice. And fourth up, which we won't actually talk about too much today, but I thought worth mentioning here. Fourth up is making sure that the interpretation of all the data and information that's collected and the communication of your findings is done well, so that you can actually, you know, share what you found and do things with those findings, and understanding what you can and can't say based on your results. So for me, I think those are the 4 kind of the broad areas. We're going to look at the first 3 today, really, but that 4th one might come up in some of the case studies later on, perhaps. Okay, so this is where I make a very #relevant reference to Jennifer Aniston's famous shampoo advert, whenever that was. This is the science bit, which is going to go on for a few minutes, but hopefully will be useful and not too mind-boggling, but as ever, do use the comment section if anything's unclear. We can address that a bit later on. Okay, so we're going to start with the fundamentals of quantitative research. So quantitative research basically is the process of collecting and analysing data that concerns quantities or can be expressed with numbers in one way or another. So that could be things like audience surveys, could be making observations of your audience about how they move around a space and you know, turning that into numbers. It could be looking at website analytics. We're going to focus on surveys today, although again, I think a lot of the principles that we talk about are relevant for all sorts of quantitative research. So another form could be ticketing, for example, ticketing data. So it's all about measuring things so that you can make objective statements about those things that you've measured. And a good thing about quantitative research is that it can give you a specific value of a point in time, which then you can refer back to in the future to see how things have changed. So you can use quant research to measure change over time in a numerical way. So you can say things got 50% better. So the fact that you end up with a number can be really useful in terms of communicating findings and communicating findings in sort of a neutral and truthful way. And you can also use quant research to look at differences and similarities either between different types of audiences, or maybe different types of like different productions maybe that you have, or different exhibitions. So you can compare things, which is good. And because everything's numbers based, we can use some statistical techniques to understand how significant differences or changes are, which in the sort of the maths analysis sort of world, significance is about, is the difference that I'm observing between these two groups, is that difference likely to be real, or is it just statistical noise? So there are some tools that we can use to look at that. So we'll touch on that a bit later on. So given that we're going to be focusing on surveys today, just to recap what they're good at doing, really. So we use surveys to understand who an audience is. I'm using audience in the broadest term, basically to describe the people that we engage with or want to engage with. So we can use surveys to understand who they are, but also to make sure that their voice is heard. So it's not just a case of finding out what percentage of your visitors come from a certain town or of a certain age or anything like that. It's also a process whereby their voice, their opinions and feelings about your organisation and about anything can be heard. So it's about making sure that the audience is at the centre of your planning. So when you think about your audience, you've actually got an accurate understanding of who they are, what they want, what they feel about things. You're not just maybe projecting what you want them to feel or who you think they are. You can actually, have some solid ground in which to describe and consider your audience in everything that you do. The idea is that you can use a survey to honestly reflect your audience. So getting as undiluted a view of what they think as possible, and also to measure progress. That's broadly what surveys are, and I guess I should make clear as well, when we say survey, we're really talking about using some kind of questionnaire tool, so some structured, consistent set of questions that we put to a number of people so we can find out things like who they are, what they think. Okay. So when it comes to actually doing a survey well, there is a point which, actually just rewinding a bit, there is a point where you have to ask yourself, is a survey actually the right approach? Is that actually going to get me the information that I need? Maybe it's not the right research approach. I think Zoe might touch on that a bit later, but we're just assuming for now that surveys are good and they are the best approach for what we want to do. So given that research is all about collecting and analysing data about quantities, some statistical things come up. So in an ideal world, if we want to find out what a group of people think about something, then we would ask everybody in that group what they think. And then we would tally up how many people say each of the different things. And then we'd know for sure, like 33% think our cafe is very good. So that would be called a census when we speak to everybody in the population that we're trying to describe. It's rare that we can do that because we normally don't have the resources, or our audiences are just too big to be able to speak to every single one of them. So instead of taking a census, we take a sample. So that's where we take a selection of people from that wider population, and then we find out who they are and what they say. And then the idea is that based on talking to that sample, we can say, so we think that our audience as a whole is probably like this, based on what this selection of people from within it said. So a sample can describe an entire population, but it can only do so, or can only do so accurately and honestly, if that sample that you take is actually representative of the whole population, and if it's large enough to overcome sampling error, which we'll address first. So one way to think about this is, although maybe they haven't been so good over the last few years, but when we think about election polls, they aim to predict the outcomes of an election by asking maybe 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 people out of the electorate, rather than ringing up every single person on the electoral roll and finding out what they think. And then theoretically, if you speak to enough people and the people you speak to are actually representative of the population, you should get a fairly good guess at who's going to win that election. Maybe that example isn't the best, but hopefully it helps kind of illustrate the idea, at least, of taking a sample from a population. So the big question when we talk about like that last point of having a sample which is large enough to overcome sampling error is, how big does that sample need to be? And it depends on the size of the population. So if your population or your audience is 100 people, you'll need to speak to a certain number of people. If your audience is 10,000 people, you'll need to speak to how many more? So it's not a linear relationship. It's not a fixed percentage. It's not the case that if you talk to 10% of your audience, that's good. It might be good, but it all depends on the size of your audience, the size of your population. So it's not a linear relationship, so you can't just say speak to 10% and that'll be good. So what we have is a tool called a sample size calculator. You can use your search engine of choice to look for that, and you'll find the calculator will tell you how many people you need to speak to achieve a certain margin of error given a certain population size. So the more people you speak to, the more accurate your findings are going to be, and the smaller your margin of error will get. A standard margin of error that we aim for is plus or minus 5% at the 95% confidence level. So what that means is, what we're aiming for is a sample that's big enough that we can be 95% confident that the answer that we get from our sample is within 5% of the answer that we would have got had we spoken to everybody in our population. Or we'll put another way, if we ran a survey 100 more times on a different random selection of people from our entire audience, then the answer that we would get would be within 5% of the true answer at 95 times out of 100. So you can probably forget most of what I've just said, other than we, as a standard, aim for a margin of error of plus or minus 5%. That's like the key takeaway. So what that actually means in practice is to achieve that margin of error depends on how big your population is. So if your population is 10 people, then you'll need to speak to all 10 of them to achieve that margin of error. If your population is 100 people, you'll need to speak to 79 of them, so a massive proportion of your audience. If your audience is 1,000 people, you need to speak to 278 of them to achieve that margin of error in your results. And then once we get up into the tens of thousands, the sample size kind of tops out at 384. So whether you've got an audience size of 100,000, a million, 10 million, it doesn't matter. Once you speak to 384 people, as long as it's a truly random representative sample of those million people, you only need to speak to 384 of them to get a result with a margin of error of plus or minus 5%. That's ever so slightly simplified, but essentially 384 is indeed the magic number for that margin of error. But I'd encourage you to use the sample size calculator whenever you're planning any research, just to be sure. And also you can do things like, okay, I think I can speak to more people than that. If I spoke to, let's say, 500 people, how would that affect my margin of error? Would that get smaller? Or maybe you need a smaller margin of error because you're making a massive decision off the back of your research, and the difference between a couple of percent one way or the other might actually be like fundamental to being able to have the robust data to make a decision. So in that case, you might want to change the margin of error that you're looking for in the calculator, and then the calculator will tell you, oh, okay, so you need to speak to 800 people if you want a margin of error of plus or minus 3%, say. So I think that's the end of the science bit, or the end of the like really numbersy. This is the only graph that we'll look at today, I think. So having said all that stuff about sample sizes and margins of error, the most important thing really is that you speak to a representative sample. It's more important, I would say, to speak to a good sample of people than a large sample of people. So we'll come back to that in a minute. I just wanted to hand over to my colleague Zoe at this point to talk a little bit about some of the prep and some of the organisational thinking which are important to do prior to doing the research.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that. Are you all right to just move the slide on one?
Absolutely.
That's okay. I only have one slide. You'll be very pleased to know, everybody. But it's an absolutely crucial one because it's all about thinking about how to get ready to undertake quantitative research. So as Dan mentioned, there was something really, really important about thinking about what your aims are for the research before you kick off. And I would say that it's really about drilling down so that you can get to a sort of succinct, almost elevator pitch about what it is that you're trying to achieve. If you're going to explain to a potential respondent or even a member of your team what it is that you really wanted this research to be able to evidence, can you drill it down into a sentence? So there is something about you really clarifying that and spending a bit of time really thinking through whether a quant survey is the right tool in order to be able to provide the evidence that you need. There are obviously lots of other methodologies out there. Obviously, the session today is very focused on kind of quant surveys, but I think it is about you really framing that research question and thinking through the different types of data that you might want to collect as part of that. Quant surveys might be one aspect of that. I think within all of this, there's a really important step about engaging your organisation. I do understand in many organisations, I think we're going to hear about this a little bit later on in the case studies that we've got talking. You know, quite often research becomes the responsibility of one person or perhaps a small team in an organisation, and potentially you kind of carry that burden around with you. You know, for those of you who potentially are Arts Council funded, it might be about achieving that magic 384 surveys in a year, and you're probably thinking, you know, how are we going to do that? And you know, might be causing you potentially some stresses as you go through the year. But really, what we want you to do is share that. It's about sharing the experience with the organisation and about really getting them to buy into the fact that you are undertaking research and what the benefits are. So there is something really important about understanding the value and also the benefits for research and really what it's going to be able to do for the organisation in the long term. And that we feel should be something that something that you talk to the wider organisation and team about, potentially your trustees as well. when we talk about that engagement process, it really is, I think, beyond, you know, your front of house manager, maybe your volunteer manager, those of you who have them, maybe if you're trying to encourage them to help you collect data on a day-to-day basis. It might be for those of you who run exhibition spaces, working with your exhibition designer to embed some form of data capture within an exhibition design. It might be about talking to your technical manager about making sure you've got a Wi-Fi signal in a particular area to ensure that your tablets can upload very regularly. It might be about your cafe manager or events manager, where you're going to be potentially collecting data to make sure that they're aware of what you're doing, and that they've got kind of capacity within that space for you to do that in a robust way. So I think, you know, before you start any research, it really is about considering all those potential collection points really within your organisation. Is it going to be about the person on the box office? Is it going to be about capturing people as they come out of an auditorium? Is it about asking people as they exit your venue having seen an exhibition? So really thinking about that visitor journey and the journeys that people take through, and the best place actually to intervene if you're going to be doing face-to-face surveys, or whether you're going to be doing it as an e-survey afterwards, thinking about how you're going to be sending that out and making sure it gets to the right people. We talked a little bit about conversing with your team and really answering their questions and concerns. I think for lots of people, there is a little bit of hesitance about collecting data. So if you're asking volunteers or maybe your own team to help with that process, very often, you know, there is a real need to invest in that professional support and training. And I think that training needs to be something which is ongoing. And there might be a need for example, for you to get your trustees' buy-in in order to approve budgets, if it is that you're looking to get external support to do that, either through training or through professional field workers. So I think engaging them in your kind of planning stage as early as possible is much more likely to get greater buy-in. If it is that you're asking your own team to collect data, there is support out there. It's something that we can help you come and do. We would say that it's probably something you do need to refresh within a 12-month period, because we're very aware that staffing and volunteers do change. But again, that support is out there, and there will be resources available for you as well, should you wish to undertake that training yourself. But I would say it's also really important that you're able to demonstrate good practice, and that good practice really should be led by yourself as the owner of the research. It's about you being visible when data is being collected. It's potentially about you also undertaking some of that data collection yourself, so you can help to iron out any potential issues more quickly. Certainly speaking from experience, that's where it's worked really well. I think going when you're very early stages of collecting any data from members of the public face-to-face, going and actually using the survey and seeing really kind of maybe where there's some sticking points, or maybe where you're getting higher levels of people are wanting to skip questions, or basically wanting to say that they don't want to take part in it, will help you address and help you to provide that additional support back to your fieldwork team. And so I think that it's really important that you're able to demonstrate that, but also able to sort of share that process with them in order to be truly invested in the process. And we'll talk about that kind of feedback loop later in the session. Effectively from your fieldwork team collecting data, how they can feedback any issues or things back to you, so that you can revise them and resolve problems fairly early on. I would say the final thing just to say is that collecting data really shouldn't be onerous. I really genuinely, having stood speaking to lots of people, and both in venues before when I've worked in venues, but also I work as an independent evaluator on certain projects within the audience agency. It really is a privilege to hear from visitors about their experiences. It can be incredibly motivating to hear what's going really well, and also where there's room for improvement. And I think the thing that I always take away from that is it's about enjoying the discussion. It's about really respecting the views of the visitor or audience member. And it's then about going about reflecting on those findings regularly within the organisation, so that you're able to make really evidence-based decisions to change things for the better and improve things. But it can also be an incredibly motivating thing to feed back to your team when things are going really well. And you can share those results with them in a fairly regular way. I'm now going to pass back to Dan. So that's just a very short section on really engaging your organisation, but also thinking about those kind of wider aims. And we're now going to move on to another section of the presentation about barriers and bias.
Great, thanks Zoe. So yeah, we're going to look at barriers and bias. I think we've kind of touched on this, maybe not with those exact words, but we've used words like representative and honest and open. And barriers and bias are really important thing to understand where they exist and the impact they might have on research and things that you can do to minimize them. So it's really all about making sure, as I mentioned before, about the fact you can speak to a representative sample of your audience, making sure that certain people aren't discouraged from talking to you, or certain people aren't more encouraged than others to talk to you. So it's really all about, first up, just putting yourself in the respondent's shoes throughout the whole process, from designing, choosing the methodology, designing questions, thinking about how you're actually going to do the field work, the on-the-ground research. Think what you would say if you were a respondent, or maybe test some of this stuff out with other colleagues or people who are less involved in the work that you're doing, see what they think. So some questions to ask yourself: are the tools and methodology appropriate for the audience that you're going to be speaking to? So things like language, whether that's about complexity of language, or there might be beneficial to offer it in different languages. Perhaps there might be certain access requirements with the methodology that you need to make allowances for. Things about if you're going to be doing your surveys in a relatively noisy environment, is that going to be a barrier for certain types of visitors more than others? So are the tools, methodology, how you're actually going to do the work, are they appropriate? The sample frame, making sure that you're not just doing surveys on Wednesday afternoons, because that's when Gary's in, and Gary's quite often doing surveys, because then that means that you'll only be talking to people who visit on Wednesday afternoons. They could be quite different from people who visit at other times. So make sure your sample frame, which is the technical term for basically your shift pattern when you're going to collect data, make sure the sample frame reflects your visit patterns. So busier periods, you would want to collect more data, conduct more interviews. Other barriers could be things like time. So if you're using a really long detailed questionnaire that takes 20 minutes to go through, then perhaps that might be a barrier for some people more than others. So you don't be speaking to people who have got all the time in the world, whereas maybe people who are popping into your gallery on their lunch break can't spare 20 minutes. So that might be a barrier. It's important to think about what's in it for the respondent. So if you're approached to ask, to take part in some research, then you might think, like, well, why would I? What's in it for me? So it's about, explaining why it's important, why it's useful, the fact that the feedback that we get from visitors like you helps us make sure we're as good as we can be at meeting your needs, stuff like that. Also, you can incentivize, you can use things like entry into a prize draw to make maybe people that are a bit more reluctant, to kind of push them over the edge and say, okay, well, maybe if I might win a Porsche, then sure, I can spare 3 minutes. Also, think about unexpected responses. So if you're a respondent, it might be quite frustrating if you've got something that you really want to feed back about that particular gallery, the air conditioning set really high, it's freezing in there, it's kind of uncomfortable. You might not pick that up if you don't include a question either specifically about aircon in Gallery 7, or if you don't have a question which is kind of an open question for any other feedback. So that's a good way of making sure this feels more like a conversation, and we're not just saying, we only want you to tell us about these 5 things and then on your way, because that's probably not going to feel great as a respondent. So yeah, think about how you would feel if you were taking part in this research, and maybe get a colleague to say what they think as well. So that way, by putting yourself in the respondent's shoes, you have a better chance of achieving a representative sample. So skewed samples lead to skewed results, which means that underrepresented voices aren't going to be heard. The wrong decisions might be made because the answers say something which doesn't actually reflect your entire audience. So I think that's why I would say representative is more important than size. If you speak to a small representative sample, at least you know how big the margin of error is. So you know that the true answer is going to be somewhere in this range. Whereas if you don't have a representative sample, then it's like, I don't really know what the true answer would be had I asked everybody. Even I've spoken to 1,000 people, all of those people were just people that visited in the month of November. So I can't really say that what they told me reflects my year-round visit, even though I know what they told me is correct within plus or minus 3%. It's kind of pointless if they don't actually represent the audience. So you can use controlled randomness to help with representativeness. So that's about saying, well, I can't do interviews every single day, but what I'll do is randomly choose 30 days over the year when I'm going to do my surveys in line with how busy I expect it to be. And also taking an active approach to representativeness is essential. So that's basically the difference between if you have a stack of questionnaires which you leave by your exit with a sign saying, please fill out a questionnaire. Nobody's going to do it. All those that are going to be those that have got a particularly strong relationship with you or have particularly strong feedback in one way or another to give you, but all the people in the middle or who don't feel as confident aren't going to pick up that questionnaire. So having an active approach and actively approaching people to say, hello, would you mind answering a few questions, telling us what you think about your visit, something like that, that's good, because that's going to encourage those people who don't have particularly strong opinions to also be included in the sample. And finally, removing bias is super important. So what we mean by bias is basically things which make certain sorts of people more or less likely to be included in your research. And it can come from a few different places. So it could come from the schedule, like I mentioned before. If you do all your shifts on a Wednesday, it's going to be biased towards people that visit on Wednesdays. The methodology, yep, as I mentioned again, if it's too long, that might mean people that tend to be more likely to be in a rush are less likely to take part. Or if it's only available in the English language, then that naturally means you're going to see a sample that's biased towards people who are more confident with the English language. But there's also two other forms of bias. So respondent bias, where respondents might be less likely to help, perhaps if they feel less comfortable in a space, or if the approach is really aggressive or something like that, then certain sorts of audience members might not respond to that and might decline to take part in the research. And second sort of bias, which you can do something about, is interviewer bias. So interviewers can introduce bias if they only approach certain people or approach certain people over others, or treat audience members differently. So I'm just going to hand over to Rimi at this point to talk about that concept of respondent bias and yeah, what you need to be aware of around that.
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. So respondent bias is when it happens when you are talking to someone who you're interviewing or surveying. First off, you know, they're obviously, if you just think of them as a person, they're not gonna know what this is about. So they're gonna have all of these like questions. So first, it's really important to be transparent and honest about what you're doing, what the research is for. So just be really clear and direct about what the research is going towards and how the respondent's contribution will help the organization or the research do better. And make it known to the respondents that we want to hear their opinion. What they say matters. Some people might say, oh, I don't know very much about this, but that doesn't mean that we don't care about what they have to say. So make sure that they feel confident that what they say is important. But obviously don't pressurize a respondent. Make sure that they give consent to their answers being used, and let them know that they have the right to withdraw their responses if they wish to do so. So consent and right to withdraw is something that you should also broach at the beginning, just to make them feel comfortable that they know that they have the power, which is like coming on to the third point, that we as researchers should be aware that we often have held the power, and we probably still do. So when we're approaching members of the public and we're saying that we're researchers, they might already have a bias in their head about what researchers mean. And so we want to kind of get rid of any suspicion that they might have towards us. And that can be helped by giving them the power, like giving them the right to withdraw and being transparent about what we do. Having a handout with the research agency or your organization's name and contact details can sometimes help, and it can be good practice if you're asking for more qualitative or like vox pop information from respondents, in case participants want to contact you afterwards with follow-up questions, or they wish to withdraw afterwards as well. So that can give them confidence. So yeah, because of the researchers having power thing, respondents might feel obliged to take part, or they might feel inferior to a researcher. So we have to be aware of that. And as we live in a post-colonial world, some global majority communities may hold suspicion against research because in the past, their people or their ancestors were treated as research subjects and they didn't have very much say in the matter of research. So be aware of the historical parts of research as well. So try and be sensitive to that. And taking all of that into account, you can imagine why respondents might have a lot of bias towards research. So just make sure that when you approach them, you are empowering the respondents to take part, you're listening to their answers, and you're not trying to provoke any type of answer from them. You don't want them to only give you positive responses. So try not to make value judgments. If they say something, don't say something like, "Oh, that's really great to hear," because that will obviously encourage only positive responses from them. You want to say, "Thank you," or "That's very interesting," and then move on to the next question in the survey. The next slide, please. Unconscious bias. So this is more relating to the interviewer, myself, or whoever is conducting the research. Obviously, both sides will have unconscious bias, but we can only do so much to try and combat the unconscious bias that the interviewer has, the researcher has. So what does it mean? It's a very wide term. So bias can refer to so many things. If you think about your own identity, if I do that with myself, then I can think that I'm a female, I'm small, I'm a young adult, professional, Japanese, university educated. All of these things can form the basis of bias. And it will only feel natural or social to approach people who seem similar to you or who look like they might be friendly. This does make sense. However, this is not a random approach of research. This is actually biased. So to try and get rid of our unconscious bias that we hold, one of the methods we can do is random sampling. Random sampling is if you were doing a survey in a busy room and you were stood by a door, you would count the people that go through the door and you might approach every third person that walks through the doorway. That would take away any of your own reasons for approaching people. That makes the reason you approach them based on an external factor. Or you might have a wristwatch, and every time the minute hand goes past the 5 on your watch, you approach whoever is closest to you. So this will remove the unconscious bias barriers that we all hold. However, it doesn't mean that it's going to be successful each time, because obviously people will reject you. So don't fear rejection. It will naturally happen as long as you're doing random sampling, but it's fine. You can just stay professional and move on. And obviously, when you do approach people, make eye contact, smile, be approachable, be friendly, and try and be aware of your bias. There's like 2 other points I've got here, which is don't assume things about people. It is really hard if you're in the field and you're trying to collect responses. If there's like a large gathering of people and they're all speaking a language that isn't English, you might assume that they can't speak English. But if they're going past you and they're part of your random sampling method, do approach one of them and ask, because you can't assume that they're not going to speak English. Don't make assumptions based on what people look like. Just try and combat your own biases, because being aware of them is the best thing to do to get over them, but it is difficult.
Where training comes in, right, Rimi?
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Rimi. That was great. So I think the final thing from me for now at least is talking about the idea of training, the fact that research is a specialized job. It's a real skill to be an interviewer, to approach people and collect data from them in a good way, following all the things that we've spoken about. So I think it's reasonable to think, or it's unreasonable to think that an individual could do that without any training. So it can be quite a daunting process as well, especially the first time you do it. It's not exactly a natural thing to do, to hang around in a foyer of a theatre and just go up to people with a clipboard and start talking to them. It's probably something that people don't really do unless it's their job to do it. So it can be a bit of a weird thing to do. So training is really important to make sure that the people that are actually going to be asking the questions, approaching the public, have the skills and the confidence to do so. So we would always say training is essential before doing research, whether that's you doing the research or some of your colleagues. So what we typically cover when we do training, which is probably as good a model as any, are the things which you can currently see on the slide. So basically what we talk about are the introduction to research. So some of the stuff that we've already spoken about today, really, things about like how research works, why it's important to collect good quality data, all that sort of thing, and going specifically into the researcher's role in that process, the field worker's role in that process of collecting data, both conceptually, so what the implications are of collecting good quality or poor quality data might be, and specifically your task will be to do X, Y, and Z, so that there's some certainty and confidence from the interviewer in what they're doing. We cover representative and how to overcome your biases, and also just practical things like how to use the tools. So looking at different types of questions and making sure it's clear how they should all be responded to. Like single choice questions means tick one box. If you tick 2 boxes, the data can't be used. Stuff like that. Also, one of the areas that can feel most uncomfortable for interviewers to ask about the more personal questions that we ask. So some of the demographic things, like ethnic origin or age or disability, all that sort of stuff can feel more comfortable to ask compared to things like how would you rate your visit today, or which of these forms of marketing have you seen, or whatever it might be. So a key part of the training is going through why those questions are really important, how that data is used, and more importantly, how that data isn't used. So that information not only makes the interviewer feel comfortable, like, okay, what I'm doing isn't a massively weird, creepy thing that's just a pointless box ticking exercise. It is actually a really important part of the whole process. And also they can pass that information on to anybody that they're talking to that asks, like, why do you need to know my age? Or are you gonna add me to a like mailing list or something? So I don't really want to give you my postcode. If you are, then the interviewer is equipped to respond to those sorts of questions and reassure the respondent that, nope, we're not going to add you to any mailing lists. We're not going to come around, knock on your door and ask why you didn't like the scones in the in the cafe. We're not going to do that. The training also covers a role-playing section where we actually try out the questionnaire, taking the role of interviewee and interviewer, so that you can get an experience of what it feels like to be interviewed, and also just to familiarise yourself with questions that might come up, the structure of the questionnaire, that sort of thing. And we also go over some of the legal things which are important to know about data protection and the Market Research Society Code of Conduct. Following training, we also recommend some kind of mystery shopping to check in on how it's all working in practice, and also ongoing quality assurance and checking to make sure that the data that's coming back in looks good quality, and also establishing a feedback loop between if other people are doing the research, between you and them, to understand if there might be any issues with the tools, or if there are any things that respondents are consistently bringing up which there isn't really room to record on the survey, that sort of thing. So like I mentioned earlier, it's really important to keep that communication open throughout the research.
I think just to add into that, certainly what I've found in the past as well, this is working with sometimes with external fieldwork agencies as well, is that you might get a fieldworker who might feel a little bit unconfident potentially, and they might be consistently not completing a survey in the right way. So you might have done training with them, done briefing with them, ahead of their session, but they still might not be completing. So that's why that quality control aspect's really, really important. It will allow you to identify people who might need that extra support, extra training, ongoing coaching and mentoring, and they could be people within your organisation, or they could be an external company that you work with. It's equally important to do with both, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of like the amount of training, we would recommend, keeping people up to date. But the training sessions that we run, I think in our experience, you need about a good 3 hours to really do the training well, I'd say. So it's not something which you can just do in half an hour or tack onto an existing team meeting. It really is something that you have to invest a bit of time into doing if you want to make sure that your researchers are all trained up and confident and able to truthfully speak the audience's voice in a consistent way, and really present your audiences with that opportunity to engage. So it all really does come back to the whole reason we do research is to make sure that the audience voice is heard clearly, and trained researchers are confident trained researchers are really like fundamental part of that whole process. So I think that brings us on.
We just got a quick question, Dan, actually,
sure.
just in the chat. So we had a question about the Market Research Society and the Code of Conduct. I'm just wondering if there's anything else you can add about that.
Yeah, I can add that it's good. I like it. It does. They do good work, the Market Research Society. I believe the Code of Conduct can be downloaded from the mrs.org.uk website, and it covers all different types of research, including the key things that interviewers need to be aware of. It crosses over and builds on data protection legislation. So yeah, if you read that, you're basically going to be good to go. Yeah, but you can probably summarize it down to maybe 10 or so kind of key things that apply to face-to-face research, which I won't go over now, but I think some resources that will follow this session will kind of cover those must-knows. But in the meantime, yeah, you can have a look at the Code of Conduct on the MRS website.
Yeah, it's quite kind of it's got a lot of legislation and kind of governance information in there, but it's really, really important if you're going to do things properly. So
absolutely, and you don't need to be a member of the Market Research Society to use those resources. Although if you are a member of the Market Research Society, then yeah, you get more resources, opportunities for training and mentoring, and lots of good stuff that they do.
So we've already, thank you so much, guys. So we've already got quite a lot. We've got a really nice question from Tihana coming through there. So I think we are going to get lots of questions on this. But what I'm going to ask you to do is we've got a panel session later on that would be taking place at about 3:30. But what I'd like to ask you to do now is keep putting those questions in the chat, anything that occurs to you. But what I'm going to ask you all to do now, don't run away, right? I know the temptation when you see the words breakout room come up, you think, oh my goodness, I've got things to do. So what I'd like you to do now is to perhaps partly by way of processing that enormous and brilliant download of information, guys, thank you so much, but to just start thinking a little bit about how some of these issues are affecting you and your organization or your work. So as you can see in the information we gave you about this workshop in advance, but also from what we've been talking about today, we have really focused on many of the operational issues about data collection. But we don't want to limit you to just that. We are interested in talking about other issues around surveying, but particularly around those operational issues, data collection, getting good samples, working directly with your audiences. But there may be also issues to do with how we use the data once we've got it, how we do the analysis and so on. So Megan, are you there? Can I invite you to introduce Carol, Ryan and Natalia? Thank you.
Of course, thank you. Thanks, Anne. Hi everyone, my name's Megan. I work mainly in the audience finder side of things for the audience agency. For audio description purposes, I'm a white female, shoulder length brown hair, a blue and white stripy top, and I'm in my rather grey and gloomy living room in Manchester. As Anne said, we've got 3 museums who've really kindly volunteered their time to come and talk about their experiences surveying audiences and using audience surveys in their work. They're all kind of quite contrasting scales and contrasting locations. So I'm hoping there'll be something that you can take from each of them, maybe. So without further ado, we've got Rhys from the National Museums Wales. We've got Carol from Eam Museum in Derbyshire, and she was here earlier, so I'm hoping she's going to be back. We've got Natalia from the Museum of the Home. So if you don't mind, Rhys, I'm going to pick on you and invite you to go first. And as I said before, I do apologise, I'm not going to introduce you in Welsh because that's a little bit beyond my skills, but I'm going to hand you over now to Rhys from National Museums Wales.
Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. So, yeah, audio description, I'm white male, youngish, in a check shirt. So I will just share my screen very quickly. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Great, so just a first very quick bit of context. I'm quite new to Amgueddfa Cymru and quite new to the sector as well. I've been in sort of financial services for the past 12 years or so, mainly in insight research type roles there. And I've come in to establish an insight function within Amgueddfa Cymru and really put data at the heart of the decision making within the organisation. You know, just a few comments, I suppose, on, you know, where we are, I think, as an organisation now. We're reasonably sort of immature, I would say, in terms of data literacy, infrastructure, the research programs that are kind of underway and managed at the moment, historically not been hugely funded very well. But I would say that all in relative to other sectors and relative certainly to sort of tech or financial services or others. So there's lots of scope, I think, to think about sort of improvements and doing things better in the way that we manage that. But the attitudes are really changing. So, you know, there's investment in CRM, which is currently underway. So customer management and databases. There's a dedicated insights team. So that's why I'm here. And that's quite new to the organization as well. So we have 2 FTE appointed to insight. And, you know, so the attitudes are changing. There's still more work to do to gain sort of buy-in and establish best practice processes. And really my belief and the role that I'll play is really to, as I come in, and I like to think of research as one component, or the surveying is one component in a far more integrated view and a far more holistic kind of vision of what insight can be, to enable sort of evidence-based decision making. And what I'd like to touch on, you know, here is perhaps you just step back a little bit of that and tell you where the research programs and other things weave into that vision, but actually that it's about thinking a little bit bigger about that as well. And I don't have all the answers yet, so really looking forward to sort of the questions and sort of debate and discussion later, but hopefully I know you've heard some of the answers today, and we've touched on some of those and probably hear more of those as the conversation goes on. So yeah, just thinking firstly, from my point of view, I'm still trying to map those challenges in terms of what we're kind of facing before we can even think about overcoming them. So I'll take a very much more theoretical kind of view at the moment of where we are, what we're thinking about, and what we're looking to implement, rather than necessarily talk you through about success stories, because for me it's still very new, and we're still very much at the kind of early stages of kind of mapping out what Insight's going to do for the organization. But there are three areas basically. One, making sense and investing in our data. So thinking again holistically about kind of the data that we've got through from sort of the behavioral data we might collect on audiences, the visitor numbers, kind of online, and where people spend time on, trying to think, what does that give us? What does it, how can we use that? How can we collect it, store it, govern it, make sure that it's kind of available for use, that it's in some sort of system that we can manage and actually draw some value from. So that's step one. I'll talk about more of that in a sec. Second is around establishing really Insight at the heart of the governance and the reporting structure. And this goes to really making sure that we set the right objectives, we translate those objectives into things that we can measure, into research objectives that we can go out and think about what data, what research are we going to do, and how does it ladder back to the strategies, the vision? How does it ultimately give us, an answer about how we're going to move forward, how we're going to move the dial on the strategy that we've got. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit then around, some of the research kind of programs that we're kicking off or have got underway, and some of the challenges we're facing specifically within some of the things we're trying to measure. Cool. So in terms of data, the first context and sort of challenge point around this really is that, so we're reasonably data immature in terms of kind of the data, with the CRM system, whilst it's been invested in, is still being built. So we don't have that kind of customer management system at the moment to kind of draw from or draw insight analytics to be able to use that. And there's also difficulty collecting visitor data or lack of identifiable customers. And particularly, one of the challenges we face is through COVID. We've had pre-booking systems. Those pre-booking systems, as just to explain, actually, we're free to enter site, so actually there's no need for anyone to purchase a ticket to come in. So in that respect, we might be different to some of your organizations, but actually for us, we don't necessarily know who comes in through the door on any given day. That changed during COVID and actually provided us with a wealth of information that we were able to survey off the back of, collecting email details to enable us to do recontacting surveys and other things. But we're going back now into a phase of we don't necessarily have that. So how do we look and develop the data, the systems that we've got in order to give us that information? And really the solution around that has been to start developing a data strategy. So before I think you can get to research and understanding what kind of gaps research can plug in your understanding, you need to understand what you've got already and how to make use of that. So it's a wide-ranging piece of work, but really looking at kind of what data do we have? What does it tell us about our audiences? How is it useful? Why do we want it? How are we going to use it? And finally, thinking about how we're going to change our processes to make sure that we have this data and we can use it in the future. So some of the sort of the uses for that at the moment, we're using Audience Finder. So we're using that at the moment off the back of those kind of tickets, pre-booked tickets, where we're sending e-surveys out and people can respond, and that's giving us, insight into customers we didn't have before. We're building the CRM capability, but so we need to go a lot further. And I think the thinking at the moment is, how do we develop processes? How do we change some of the processes to actually deliver data? And I think to do that, we've got to change the mindset within the organization that data has value, that there's a value to collecting it. And that actually turns into both commercial benefit or just simply delivering better experiences down the line. So that's one area of kind of, data. The second one would be, another challenge we're facing is the data literacy or perceived value, as I mentioned, across the organization. and an unwillingness really from some to trade off on things like either customer experience or trade off on some commercial value in order to collect data. So it's really trying to establish, the solution for us at the moment is trying to establish a committee to look at data, to look at insight, that we're discussing that at the most senior level within the organisation, that we embed that as part of the governance and part of the processes to really, do a few things. One, win hearts and minds through example and through reporting, to make sure people have the right information at their kind of fingertips to make the right sort of decisions, but also to start to demonstrate the value that, bringing research or analytics or, data science to the organization, that we can make decisions upon it. Cool. And then I think, requirements, to say there are a couple of things to think about with this. I mean, visualization and your data visualization tools. I mean, certainly with people that aren't necessarily used to looking at graphs, charts, numbers, which, in my experience is much of kind of leadership teams, then actually trying to display your information in a visual, engaging way to show the value of it, I think is worth investing in. So thinking about the sort of the data visualization, something that we're doing internally at the moment, trying to move from essentially where everyone's reporting things either through just sending a spreadsheet out or sending something in a Word document to something far more visual, far more engaging, having platforms built in to say our CRM system that we can deliver that straight out. And I think in a similar fashion, using something like Audience Finder, where we have that platform built and that visualization tool built in, that it's easier for people to see what they're looking at. That's on data. Then thinking about sort of insight-led sort of governance and reporting, I think there's one thing I'm kind of looking at the moment really is we have a new strategy. Within that strategy, there are sort of 7 pillars, which we're looking to promote and looking to really guide the business around. One of those, for instance, will be widen engagement, which I'll talk a little bit about when I get to our kind of research challenges in a second. But really, a lot of the way we're measuring this at the moment is around outputs. So we haven't really thought about how does the new strategy link to the way that we're measuring it, the way we're understanding it. So we've got very much kind of output focused figures. So to give you the example on wide engagement there, I mean, we're simply tracking visitor numbers against that at the moment, rather than actually looking more in depth at, say, ethnicity, age, disability, and how we're reaching different audiences. We're still targeting growth in visitor numbers overall, rather than having a debate about whether or not we shouldn't be targeting volume overall, but quality. So targeting different sort of ethnicity, different age groups, areas where historically we've perhaps not been as represented as we want to be. And I think the key is really, setting objectives and understanding how we're going to translate those objectives into research objectives is pretty critical in thinking, how can you move forward as an organization? How can we demonstrate that we're doing the things we set out to do? So never probably underestimate the value of having deep, meaningful conversations around objectives, spending a lot of time on that and a lot of time on the brief around kind of what you want to do from a research point of view, or what you want to do from a data analysis point of view before you get into that. Often, I found that it's the part of the journey that most people skip. We don't set clear, smart objectives, and in the end, if you don't evaluate, you can't evaluate or measure anything if you're not got complete agreement on the thing we're trying to measure and the thing we're trying to demonstrate. So again, we're using Audience Finder around that. One of the critical things I want to build is around developing customer dashboard. So really understanding what is it that's important to customers that we should be focused on. At the moment, we simply have an NPS figure within the KPIs. That's actually pretty new as well. That's just been brought in since I've come in. But actually, NPS is a very widely used, and there's a lot of consensus around the value of NPS in reporting. But unless you understand, what are the drivers, and do some, driver analysis around that to, again, through sort of commissioning research to do it, you can't really focus on the right thing. So, it could be that the content, for instance, drives engagement or drives experience. It might be that actually just having welcoming staff is the key variable in actually driving that experience. But at the moment, we just don't know. We don't know what are the things that we need to focus on. So therefore, what are the actions and things we can take? What are the different tactics we can employ to drive that number up? But I say the first thing is making sure that we've got the right number that everyone's understands, is supportive of, and we can work towards that through understanding how do we drive that metric then. So that's that around insight-led governance reporting. And finally, I just want to touch on, and these are just a few of the programs basically we're looking to install at the moment from a research point of view. And there's three things really I was going to talk about. One, visitor understanding, and how we understand who comes through the door, what they look like, what they like, what they dislike. A piece around strategy and brand. So I mentioned we've got a new strategy. That also means that our brand is developing in terms of kind of what that means and to reflect the new strategy. And finally, just a little bit about out-the-box thinking. I think, everyone, you're probably on reasonably low budgets, and you need to prioritise, where you spend your money. I mean, there are quant programs that simply cost money, and we do need to put money behind those sorts of things, but there are other ways we can think of as well, which cost a little bit less. So firstly, on visitor understanding, context and sort of challenges, as I mentioned previously, one of those key KPIs is reporting on widening engagement. So, one of our challenges is how do we achieve a representative sample in line with kind of the budgets that we've got. And I know there's been much mentioned on the call today about sort of sampling and where to use different types of samples and how you get that representative. But I think in terms of our current status, we use exit surveys. So it's very good in terms of giving us in-moment feedback. So these go out after someone's visited one of our museums, and within a matter of days we get a response from that, which marries the sort of expectation or experience of what they've had on the day. It's fairly cost efficient, and it's also benchmarked, so it's relative to other organisations, which I think is an important point. In terms of going forward, though, I mean, we know that introduces biases, as we've seen today, particularly when we're talking about ethnicity. For instance, the survey is in Welsh or English, so we don't offer it in Hindi. So naturally, we're going to introduce some sort of biases, particularly when we're talking about something like ethnicity. Similarly, if we're talking about age, or we're talking about digital poverty, we know that because it's an online survey, that actually, certain groups of people would not want to engage in that way, or perhaps not feel confident in using the technology to be able to respond. So we're introducing biases another way. So I think there are a few things to consider, and so we don't necessarily have the answers. I think the best approach we're looking to sort of integrate with the survey is having random in-person samples along, to complement what we do online. Again, you don't have the speed of feedback from some of those approaches as we might have with the online surveys and integrated into the platform. But again, it's one way that at least over the course of the year, we can start to look at that. We can understand whether or not there's any relative differences in terms of what's responding in person to a random sample versus what's responding to the e-survey. So we can make allowances then in how much bias we think there is with different types of metrics we draw from it. So again, there's lots of thinking that we need to do to make sure that they're robust, that the samples, are showing what they need to. And the other thing I think you can do in this instance is compare it against other organisations. So I mentioned, the benchmarking being an important factor of kind of what we do at the moment, but those benchmarks are true. Those biases are true when there's the same mode is being used by a different site or a different museum, a different arts theatre, opera house, whatever it might be. So actually comparing and contrasting against other organisations in sector to understand where you sit against that and whether you're better or worse can give you some indication. But in our aspiration, really what we'd like to see is, as a minimum, that our attendance reflects the society at large in Wales. So actually the only real way we can do that is against the census, which means we need to introduce random sampling to give us that confidence that we're measuring against the same yardstick. So that's talking about visitor understanding. I mentioned strategy and brand. So we've got new strategy, brand development underway. At the moment, we don't really, again, we have the exit surveys and in moment feedback online, but it doesn't actually tell us what people think of the brand. It doesn't necessarily assign different kind of values perhaps that they associate with that brand. I mean, for instance, we want to be seen as fairly proactive in terms of the way that we stand up against different issues. We want to be seen as kind of energetic. So all of these things, we need to start to think about how we embed that across our surveys. So that's another area that we're looking to kick off, is brand measurement, awareness, understanding identity of that brand, and as well, whether or not the strategy is translating into positive attitudes and perception of the organization as a whole as well. And then finally, I mentioned this sort of out-of-the-box thinking areas as well. So given the budget constraints that we're often kind of working against, we often end up, with some anecdotal feedback potentially just collected through emails. For instance, for us at the moment, this might be head teachers commenting on the learning program. There's no structure really around some of the way that we do that and some of the way we sample that. So that's something that we can look at. But we're not tapping into feedback on the ground either. So listening to the staff that directly have conversations with people that come to the museums. And, we haven't got a big program at the moment of leveraging, well, I would say is free data, but, really understanding kind of secondary research, understanding what else is out there, and drawing that in and starting to make some decisions, because we can't always afford to do primary research. So I think secondary research and having a program around that, so you're kind of tapping into different work that other agencies might be presenting for free, or actually using tools such as Google Analytics, for instance, that can help you understand how web behaviors are happening across your sites. So again, different sort of solutions. What we're keen to kind of explore is, working with communities and working with partner organisations. So for instance, on widening engagement, again, working with different religious group leaders within different communities in Wales gives us an understanding of kind of how the people they represent and the people as part of those kind of like the charity organisations or different parts of society, what do they think, and what, so again, working with those different groups can offer us, just through one or two qualitative groups, a much broader sample or a much broader view of kind of how society is thinking. I've mentioned, say, secondary research programs, so really thinking about kind of how we can bring in and use different kind of insights and different research that other organisations are providing. And then setting up staff feedback programs as well. So we don't currently have any sort of conversations with staff just about their impressions for what's working, what's not working, what do customers and visitors comment on. And then the final area, which I think is possibly interesting to kind of explore as well, is sector collaboration, and particularly using, we're all interested in similar things, and we're all interested in understanding visitors and audiences within, say, cultural or arts or heritage sector, then actually pairing up and working together to commission a single piece of research that can help us answer the questions that we probably all commonly face is another way that we perhaps reduce budgets, but make sure that we can, somewhere in between, I suppose, the secondary research and the primary research, where, we just collaborate to ensure that we're both getting out of it what we need, but we're actually paying a much lower cost in to actually get that insight. So that was it from me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rhys. That's great. Gosh, so many questions were coming into my head. Good questions coming into my head as you were speaking there. Yeah, really, really great. Thank you. I should say that our lovely panelists are going to be sticking around for a conversation following this. So if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, but you can also speak up and ask as we get into that session later. But I'm a little bit conscious of time now, and I'm sorry, Rhys, we can't follow up on any of your points right now, but I'm gonna hand over to Carol, if that's okay, so also from a museum, but of a rather different scale to National Museum Wales. Carol's from Eam Museum in Derbyshire, so I'll, if she's around, I'll let her introduce herself and take it away.
Hi.
Oh, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me? Well,
you're all good.
Hey, ideally you won't be able to hear my two dogs who are a bit hyper because I've been away for a while. Right, so I am from Eyam Museum. Eyam is a village in the Peak District at the very kind of north end of Derbyshire, not a million miles from Sheffield. And we tell the story of the plague. If you may remember covering this at school, lots of people do. This is where the village acquired the plague from a journeyman tailor who brought it with him from London in a bale of cloth or old clothes or something similar. And there was great speculation at the time as to whether it was transmitted by rat fleas or by human lice. Anyway, whichever it was pretty effective. So the village decided to quarantine itself. And a large number of people died, clearly, but doing that prevented it from spreading to the surrounding area and probably wiping out half the north of England. So that was a pretty brave thing to do. So we are a charity, so we don't receive any government funding at all, either nationally or locally. In some ways, it's great to be independent. And in other ways, of late, it's not great to be dependent pretty much on income from admissions. So the pandemic gave us the PR opportunity of a lifetime, plus on the one hand, and on the other hand, the bottom fell out of our income stream and we had to shut. So this was not so good. But where we succeeded with collecting lots of data for Audience Finder was when we reopened, we introduced an online booking system, and as well as buying your ticket and getting an email to confirm, we sent people a link so they could do the survey, and large numbers of people did. What we were doing before was having the staff, who are largely volunteers, accost people on the way out and ask them if they wouldn't mind filling this thing in. And it wasn't great because a lot of people weren't that willing to do it. The building is small and cramped, and you're stuck there for 10 minutes or so filling in things on a tablet, and that wasn't brilliant either. So we did much better when we did it online. I know a lot of museums who weren't already using an online admissions system started doing it. And I think, as far as I understand from various other forums and things I've been in, quite a lot of people have decided they don't need to do it anymore. However, I think we do, and I would very much like us to continue. So on the one hand, we would have people who pre-booked, who like to be planned and organised and so on. And on the other hand, we have walk-ins. So how we would get surveys completed from walk-ins now, I'm not quite sure. That's something we have to try and work out. So we have a lot of data from our rough 30,000 plus visitors a year, which is not bad for a little tiny place. So the question that we have, I think, is what does the data tell us, and to what extent is it skewed? So initially it was skewed by coming from people whom our volunteer staff thought looked friendly and approachable. And now it's skewed by the kind of person who organises their family or partner or whatever, or themselves, into booking an online trip, which is going to skew it in some way as well. I guess, but whatever data you have, I would imagine you could argue it's skewed in some way or another. We know that our primary groups are good old home and heritage and dormitory dependables. So most of our bookers are female, and most of them are 45 plus, and the numbers increase the older they get. So that's useful information, and we have to work out what that means and what we can do to kind of alter that. And we have many challenges. One is the size of the building. So we probably don't suddenly want to double our visitor numbers because there's nowhere there for them to go. The village probably wouldn't be too thrilled if suddenly 60,000 people turned up a year instead of 30. Eyam is has a bit of a theme park feel, particularly in the summer, because not only is there the museum, there are all sorts of sites related to the plague story that people can go and visit. So we have to think about what we do. And if we did nothing at all, we would continue to have that kind of footfall. And as long as the national curriculum stays the same, we would continue to have visits from school parties. So school parties are another data gap because we don't get any surveys from them, but they tend to come from the cities where the ethnic variation is much greater. Clearly they're much younger. So they would, if they continue to visit or they came back later on with their own families, do a great deal to kind of broaden out our coverage. So I think we have a question of how to get people to do that. We need to consider how we engage with people in ways other than turning up at the door. So it would be interesting to hear from the other speakers whether you're looking solely at people visiting or how you engage with people who look at the collection online or who attend things like this. So I think those are things that we need to do. So there we go. We want to continue. I want us to continue collecting the data and to be able to do more in terms of exploring how we can broaden these things out. So I think all ideas would be greatly welcome, really. And I guess that's it. So no slides.
Didn't need them.
Didn't need them, right?
Didn't need them. No.
That's what you think.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Carol. That was great. Yeah, I think what really stood out for me in what you're saying is that you're just taking such a thoughtful approach to doing this. You're not just going, right, we're just going to get a survey out and get as many people as possible to fill it in. You're really thinking, is this the right approach for our visitors and for this type of visitor? And why are we doing surveys and why is it important? And it harks back to the point that Reese made about having objectives and knowing why you're doing a survey and what is that going to do for you, and it's not just an exercise in data collection. I think that really came through really strongly for me. So yeah, we're always up for hearing ideas from people. You know, this is a place for sharing ideas as well. So if anything that Carol's mentioned, you think, oh, we might have a solution for that or an idea with that, we could put you in contact and let you have a chat. Lots of ways to do that. Again, I'm conscious of time again, sorry. I'm going to move on. I'm going to ask Natalia if she's here, if she wouldn't mind going next from the Museum of the Home.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to share my screen.
That's worked.
There you go. Fantastic. Yeah, so hello everyone. So my name is Natalia. I'm one of the assistant visitor experience managers at the Museum of the Home, and I've been kind of leading the team, the visitor experience team, in launching the Audience Finder survey after a lengthy redevelopment of the museum and reopening. So just some details. So formerly we were known as the Jeffrey Museum, and we reopened in June of last year under a new brand after a lengthy renovation project that lasted 3.5 years under the name of Museum of the Home. Our purpose as a museum is to reveal and rethink the way we live in order to live better together. So that has been our kind of guiding vision, and also in the way we interact with our visitors, both returning visitors from the olden days of the Jeffrey Museum and new visitors that we're attracting under this new brand. So what's important is that the Audience Finder survey has both kind of a quantitative and a qualitative effect on kind of our audience strategy, because it's very important for us to understand how our existing visitors and friends of the museum from before are reacting to the new renovation. It's also important to understand how we're attracting new audiences and how they're responding to what we're offering, and also listening to the views of both groups in kind of shaping our future together under this new brand. And that has also kind of collided with the pandemic. So our kind of redevelopment project was delayed due to issues relating to the COVID pandemic. And that's also presented a challenge in kind of reintroducing the Audience Finder survey in our museum. So we use surveying in order to survey both our returning and new visitors. As we'll discuss later, there have been a few issues we have discovered with capturing those new visitors to the museum. We're looking at what the needs are of our visitors, as well as the expectations they may have had about the refurbishment, but also expectations they have from their visit in general to a museum in a post-pandemic world. And again, using that to inform our audience development strategy. So how do we run the surveys? So previously we had a group of volunteers that would come in a few times during the year to conduct the audience finder surveys on paper with visitors. Upon reopening, we've incorporated the surveying duties as part of the visitor experience host duties. So we've been training our visitor experience hosts to conduct these surveys for the audience finder agency. We also have email surveys, e-surveys that are sent as exit surveys at the end of visitors' visit to the museum, but that only captures visitors who have pre-booked with us and whose emails we have. We've also supplemented that with face-to-face surveys that are on a tablet and having our visitor experience host talking to visitors and conducting it that way. The e-surveys and the face-to-face tablets have had separate targets of 380 attached to them. So that will enable us to kind of see the data that we're getting through the two methods, compare methodologies, and also ensure that we have a more higher quality data set. So some of our challenges and how we've overcome them. So with the e-surveys, one of the kind of pros and kind of has been that it doesn't require extra staffing. It's something that we have been able to build into our booking system at a one-off cost, but over the year, that one-off cost is less than, say, having to hire an extra member of staff to conduct it every day. It's also a more anonymous and discreet way of conducting the surveying, and visitors are more likely to share their views openly than they would with, say, a visitor experience member of staff who's asking them to fill in a survey. And we've also had a wider reach, reaching different people who've pre-booked to visit the museum. The only main cons we've encountered have been technical issues with the booking system and kind of capturing tickets at the beginning of the year. So not every visitor who pre-booked and was scanned in may have necessarily received that survey, but that has been ironed out. And also we have discovered that we haven't captured any first-time visitors, which is kind of very interesting because we have managed to meet our target of 380 and almost double it, but yet the visitors we're capturing are returning visitors. Then the next is looking at the face-to-face tablet. So that has kind of presented more challenges to us as an organization. So firstly, due to COVID, we've had staff shortages that we've had to deal with and various sort of juggling responsibilities, which has meant that we've delayed the introduction of the face-to-face method of surveying. One way to kind of combat that has been that once we did reintroduce it, we were able to set targets for each day of the week in kind of meeting our audience finder survey target for the end of the financial year and being optimistic but reasonable with our targets. So we would aim for 10 a day. Another challenge has been declining visitor numbers. So although the reopening attracted a lot of visitors back on site, we have had issues over Christmas with visitors cancelling their visits due to the Omicron variant and having to close for Christmas, again, due to the pandemic. So again, due to less visitors on site, we've had to kind of approach more people when they are on site, and perhaps that has led to a bit more bias in the data we're receiving. We have another solution is we have combined sort of visitor surveying with the general museum welcome at times. So at the end of the day, when a visitor experience host has finished selling tickets and they're kind of helping people make their way out of the museum and finding out about their visit, they have used the audience finder survey as a tool to kind of capture that post-visit feedback at the end of the day. Another challenge has been kind of training new teams, a new team that we have deliberately recruited not to be from just museum backgrounds, but we've recruited very diverse teams that come from different fields of work. And some of them may not have had that experience of working in a museum before or working in fundraising. Hence, it's been a challenge in getting the team on board and understanding of surveying techniques and also feeling more confident in approaching visitors and asking for sensitive information. So one way that we try to kind of combat that challenge is by providing one-to-one training to our team. So although the team had a training session with the audience finder, about the audience finder with the audience agency. A lot of questions came up following the training, and we realized very quickly it would be much more beneficial to have one-to-one training with each member of the team. We have around a team of 26 hosts, and trying to get each one trained up, make them understand the value of what each survey is and address any personal concerns they may have about data collection. And that has been very successful. We found that hosts have discovered increased confidence in approaching visitors, and that is reflected in the increase in numbers of surveys that are completed. It also helped that that was made a part of the visitor experience host job description, so that when hosts joined, that was part of their role, and they understood that it's part of delivering a great visitor welcome, it's understanding our audiences. Another kind of interesting challenge we face as an organization, and I think that's partly because we've reopened under a new brand, is over surveying. So as we've kind of put on different temporary exhibitions, as we've opened up different areas of the museum, new galleries, we have had surveying built in at various parts. So there has been a risk where a visitor may be in on a busy day and they're being surveyed by the learning team, they're being surveyed by an exhibitions team regarding a new exhibit, and they're being asked to feedback at various points in the museum about different elements. So that may present a challenge when they're then asked to also complete the audience finder survey. So that is something that we're still kind of trying to find a solution for looking forward, because it is very important for us to get our visitors' reactions to every different part of the museum and how our programming. However, it's important we all look towards one vision, and we're able to funnel that feedback through one source. And that's something it'd be great to hear any ideas going forward. And finally, kind of the challenge has also been bias. So we have discovered that even though there are some similarities in the data we receive through email surveys, exit surveys, and face-to-face tablet surveys, we're still not capturing any first-time visitors, which is very kind of, we're still trying to find out why, because we definitely know they are coming because we're getting feedback from them via email, via feedback cards. We're getting feedback from new-time visitors at various spots in the museum where visitors are encouraged to interact and leave their thoughts on various aspects of the museum. So it'd be interesting to understand why we're missing their voices on our audience finder surveys. And one element that we've done as a museum is we're very visitor first orientated. The visitor comes first for us. And as a museum, we're opening up and trying to create a home for our visitors as a museum of the home. And that's things I found quite successful in kind of framing that the audience finder and surveying under the guise of good customer service. And I found that's been very helpful with getting the team on board and getting more visitors to engage with our survey. And I've also kind of tried to lead from the front. And as we talked about previously, is kind of doing the surveys myself and understanding what it is that the team is experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and kind of sharing tips and tricks between each other during briefings and debriefings. So what have we been trying to achieve, or has been the result? So we're only at the start of our journey, both as a museum under a new brand, but also at the start of our surveying journey. And we're both learning and adapting. So what I think the next point for us as a museum is to kind of look at the data we're receiving and try and look at whether it's a quality data set and what we can do to improve the quality and minimize any bias that may be emerging. And it's also very important for us to understand those new audiences and find a way to capture them. And thank you, everyone. And yeah, just a few questions that I would love to hear from you all is kind of how you, as museums and as cultural organizations, dealing with surveying in a post-COVID world, because that's definitely has been something that's affected kind of our operations. And also if anybody's experienced similar issues, particularly in capturing new visitors, and would like to hear if there's any solutions that you'd suggest.
Brilliant. Thank you, Natalia. That was great. Lovely to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm conscious of time again, sorry. But yeah, what came up for me really strongly in what you were saying there as well, Natalia, was this importance of getting your frontline staff engaged. It just seems like it's been so crucial for you to getting that, you know, really good insight and getting them really on board with what is this survey we're doing and why is it important. That was just loud and clear all the way through. Yeah, and also just the importance of training. And you've really, I mean, training people on a one-to-one basis even is a huge commitment, obviously, from your part, but it seems to be paying off. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters. It's been great to hear from you. And for me, it's really interesting, even though you're all from very different organisations, there are common threads coming through, some differences, of course, but some definitely some commonalities there as well. So yeah, great to hear from you. I'm hoping we've had a couple of requests for those of you who shared slides. We've had a couple of questions from people if we could share those slides more widely with everyone who's here today. So if you're happy for us to do that, please do send them to me and I'll disseminate, but we can come back to that. I'm gonna pass back to Anne now, I think, because we're spot on time, if that's okay.
Sorry, my direct line, somebody no doubt I can't reach, by the way, no doubt wants to talk to me. So just ignore that for 2 seconds. So sorry. Breathe. It'll go away in a second. Oh my goodness. I was just going to say thank you so much to our 3 speakers there, because whether you can hear me or not, I think the sorry, it stopped. I think just they're really amazing to hear. It feels to me there's the thing that maybe all 3 of you really have in common is not only a sort of love and passion and belief in research, but also, and very importantly, that you have a real empathy for your audiences and users. And I thought that came through, and I was thinking about, you know, in a way, what we were talking about earlier on in our first walkthrough was how important taking our visitor eye view or our respondent eye view of the situation sorry, is incredibly, life goes on, is incredibly important in all of our work and how we manage to do it. So I was just, could you be quiet, guys, please? Sorry. But anyway, so a little bit of empathy in my household wouldn't go amiss. So I wanted to say thank you all very much for that. But most importantly, I think you probably in your different ways have all touched on many of the challenges and issues that have been raised in the amazing Jamboards. So I really would beg you to stay with us, because I'm sure that people have got questions for you, in which case do please put them in the chat. What I'm going to say now is I'm going to invite us to go back and have a look at those Jamboards. If somebody could just post the link in the chat again, that would be amazing. But as you'll see, we've done a bit of swapping. I've done a bit of swapping around and tried to organise some of the things that, the themes that we were talking about. And what I'm going to suggest now is I'm not going to put on any fancy bits of screens. Let's just talk to each other face to face for a while. So do please put your screens on. Please feel free to raise those. But a couple of really interesting questions here around QR codes, venues to linking in surveys. It can make things easy, but some people have an aversion to using them or don't know what they are. Would a combination approach be best to get a broad sample? QR codes, in-person surveys, email list. Dan, can I pick on you first? Have you got any thoughts about QR codes?
Absolutely, yeah. I think so that the green post-it, which says, would a combination be best of different approaches? Yep, I would say. So I think using QR codes to allow people to launch a survey on their own device is a really good option to give people, partly because of like social distancing and COVID reasons, also partly because people might rather answer the questionnaire on the bus on the way home rather than right there and then. So I think it's another option to give people. It can be the only option you use, but I think reducing bias, the more ways that you can give people to talk to you, the less likely it is you're going to be excluding people. So yeah, QR codes can be part of that mix. I think probably the main thing to be aware of if you are using QR codes is that, yeah, not everybody knows how to use them. And the stuff that the QR code launches on their device should be designed to be answered on a device. So that might mean asking questions in a certain way, using certain accessibility guidelines to make sure that everything's readable and that kind of thing. But yeah, QR code is definitely a good thing. And I think from our experience, we're finding that one of the upsides of the pandemic is that more people know what QR codes are and are more used to using them. So they do work, they can work
it does feel as though the big issue that we're going to come on and talk about around diversity and representativeness, that actually as soon as you start using anything a bit newfangled, you are, of necessity, you might lose some people at that point. I mean, that this is really the trade-off, isn't it? There's something about the frictionless experience, which is good for some people, which of course causes problems for others. I noticed someone in here has talked about, which is something that we're quite sympathetic to, has talked about the fact there's all these fancy ways of doing it, but they've discovered that doing things on paper, it might look medieval, but actually it is the easiest way of being most accessible to the most people. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Dan, or indeed anybody else.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Paper's good. Paper still works. It might look and feel old-fashioned, but there are definite advantages to it. It can often be quicker to use a pen and paper as an interviewer than to use a tablet. So, and also there's potentially more options to hand the questionnaire over to people to answer maybe some more sensitive questions, which might be a good thing as well that you maybe wouldn't do with a tablet. So paper is definitely worth considering. I think overall, I could probably say this about, as a little asterisk after most of my answers today, or most things I say, that research is never perfect, and it's always about a series of trade-offs, again, between representativeness and the resources you have to deliver it, and the sample size you achieve. And there's no such thing as a perfect research project. I think it's just all about being mindful of the different biases that different approaches might introduce, and the pluses and minuses of different approaches.
Yeah, no, brilliant, thank you. One of my colleagues has very helpfully is screen sharing, so we can see the questions, but they're screen sharing on the wrong screen, because I deliberately put those really complicated methodological questions at the end, and the easy ones I thought we could start with on frame 2. So I don't know who's screen sharing, but if you could take us back, thank you for doing so. It's actually very helpful. Could you take us back to frame 2, which is what we were looking at? So if you're looking at the screen, we're there, and if you're looking in the Jamboards, we're just looking at those issues there. Sorry, I was taking the mic. I was really grateful for you doing that. Thank you. Okay, so it's a really interesting question here that it is both sort of a fun question, but one I'm really interested in around creative methods of, creative research methods in general. And one of the things I would observe is that I've just done a lot of work with my colleagues at the Centre for Cultural Value, which I will signpost to you if you are interested in creative research methods. And we've been looking at, along with my other colleagues at the Audience Agency, we've been looking at what we've called the cultural evaluation principles, which is really looking at how, both at the ethics and the methodological issues about what standards we should set ourselves in the cultural sector for doing research. And it's interesting that there is definitely a kind of a bit of a prejudice against quantitative research methods at the moment. It's sort of almost on a sort of philosophical level, but as we've talked about, quantitative research can be both very accessible to many organizations, but it's also, it's really necessary to understand things at scale or in numerical terms. It's all very, it's great to understand experience in some levels, but that just might not be the right way of understanding the breadth and the range of, or the proportion of a community that you're serving and so on. So I think these questions here are actually saying, okay, we accept we have to do quant, but are there ways of making it less boring? I think is what we're talking. Again, Dan, I'm going to throw that at you, but please feel free to refer it to anyone else. In fact, Natalia, Reese, Carol, if you've got anything to say about that, I'd be really interested. Actually, Reese, I might pick on you to give us an alternative view. How do we make surveying a bit less boring?
Give one example of how we can do that in a specific context. So I really like that question of like, how can we just ask one question in an interesting way? Because that means you're not asking anything you don't need to know. I think that's a fundamental thing. Like, don't ask anything unless it's essential that you ask it. So yeah, I'll leave it up to you to decide what essential means. But yeah, if we're just talking about asking one question, a few years ago, we were evaluating a public dance project, and the one thing we needed to know, I think it was like where people were visiting from. So were they visiting from outside the local authority where it was taking place, something like that. We needed to make some kind of a map of who had seen it. So to do that, we we had a slightly interactive element to the dance piece where people, audience members, were given little luggage tags to write like 2 things on, something about their response to the performance and their postcode, I think it was, and then that luggage tag was put on a hat stand, laundry line, something like that. It was somehow kind of a, we ended up with this mass of luggage tags with information on, which formed part of the narrative of the performance, but could also then be used subsequently to answer that one question we had about where people visited from. So sometimes incorporating data collection which is the driest term on earth, but incorporating data collection in some way into the art that's being shown can be a good way of making it less boring and making it kind of intrinsic to the experience. Yeah,
I like it a lot. I think that there's also, I think there may have been something that lay behind this question that was specifically, could we make the audience finder survey a bit less boring as well? I think may also have been one of the questions, and I might just refer that to my audience finder colleagues in a moment and just see if you have a view on that. I think there are reasons, but I'm really interested in hearing a response to that. Meanwhile, Rhys, did you have any thoughts about that? You come from a very strong banking research background. What's your thoughts about making surveys fun, making the forms fun?
Yeah, the first thing I say is boring is good.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
That's not just because I come from banking, but no, I think then it was read Dan Arelli, who's done a lot of work around kind of behavioral economics and thinking most of his experiments are purposely very, very boring because actually that's what drives the best research result. So often I think it's worth bearing that in mind. But if you do want to go into sort of how to make it a bit more exciting, I think visualization is really important. So if you've got a Likert scale, for instance, so that's 1 to 5 rating, if you can use a phaser bar of some description to kind of drop and push that into one place or another, actually that's that can be slightly more engaging way to interact with it. I think it's worth looking at some qual methods as well and how they read across to quant surveying, such as putting people in the shoes of something else. So, if you want to use role play or something, or describe something, or give something slightly imaginative to work on when you write the quant questions, that could be another way as well. And I suppose the final point I was going to make is that it depends when you ask the question as well, because I think you can, it's always with research, it's about mitigating some of the biases. You can't exclude them. It's research is a model of reality. It's not reality itself. So I don't know if anyone can see the diagram quickly I've put up there, but that's the sort of curve you've got with engagement going up and time going across. What you're always going to find is there's a sweet spot. It's not the first question, but what you really want to do is embed your most important questions, say maybe 2 minutes or 90 seconds into the survey, because that's when engagement's at its optimum. So if your metrics, and go back to objectives and things like that, if your KPIs are focused on NPS scores, net promoter scores, or focused on satisfaction or something else, that's where you want those questions. So you've got the most, cognitive kind of processes going in the respondent at that right time, and then your other questions that are less important later on, because you will naturally, no matter how exciting you make it feel, there's always a limit.
And I suppose it's worth saying, isn't it, that on principle, one of the reasons for keeping the forms boring and neutral is that anything else you introduces the possibility of bias, and that is part, and that's really what the challenge. So boring is good is actually to do with the principle of non-bias. So what looks great to you might not look great to somebody who doesn't consider themselves to be, a creative person like you, or interested in opera, or whatever the things are that you're introducing. So even using pictures and so on has that effect of possibly singling people out, making them feel that this is not for them. We talked at several people, I think you all mentioned the difficulty of getting first-time attenders to feel confident. Again, it comes up here, first-time attenders to feel confident about the response you get if you approach someone who's like, oh, you don't want to know what I think because it's the first time I've been here. There's this sort of assumption that we only want to know what really dyed in the wool, already convinced, persuaded people think. And of course, actually, we're very often interested in first-time attenders first. So this issue of bias is really important. However, Louise makes a really important point here that we're still looking for fun, diverse, and of course, relevant ways of capturing that sort of quick feedback. And I think this point about using social media is actually super, super important. And I'm actually, Louise, I'm really interested in this, and we're just thinking about doing a little bit of piloting around some of this. So do see me later, as they say. But I would say, principle-wise, and again, please feel free, those of you who are actually out there doing it, the idea, if you know that your population is very keen on and interested in, and for the most part uses a particular platform, then of course, why not use it, would you say? Research experts, would you broadly agree with me on that?
Yeah, I think as long as you're aware of like the potential limits to who you're speaking to through that platform and the biases that might be introduced. So if you think that the biases are actually pretty low, then yeah, why not?
Exactly. So that you can see that the principles are sort of playing out here, but I do think that's really interesting. So you need that almost like that pre-research where you can sort of find out whether or not whether or not that is going to be a suitable platform. If you think a good, that it's fairly representative of that population that you're interested in, it feels to me as a very useful way of doing that sort of more agile, feeding the feedback in as you're going along. There are lots of reasons why we might want to use those methods. I really loved the way that your slide, Natalia, where you showed us the challenges and solutions. These are the challenges we've got. Here are the solutions that we've tried to come up with, which I thought was a really lovely, clear way of thinking. And I'm going to be adopting that. I think that's something we should think about of dropping into that new resource. But I notice you've talked a little bit about this question of the over-surveying that some people have mentioned there. So tell us about, Natalia, that question of over-surveying, is that something that you know to be the case, or that people feel may be the case? Because it comes up again in quite a lot of the comments and so on.
So yeah, the issue of over-surveying, I mean, we are aware that there's multiple points where visitors will be, on busy days in particular, asked to feedback, but also it's kind of from our feedback from our visitor experience hosts, who have been saying that a visitor would have said, when approached, the visitor would have said, oh, I've already completed a survey, in that room. Oh, I've already done this survey. So it's this idea that, we've had to kind of explain why this survey is different to the other survey they may have completed, or why it's different to the feedback they will complete on the feedback card, or why it's different to like a breakout area that we have where visitors can write on the wall with feedback. So it's kind of about managing expectations for each, managing the different surveying methodologies, and then just not overburdening visitors, because then they may say, no, actually, I've already spent 10 minutes talking to your other team member for this other survey.
Yes, and I wanted to come on to this question about length of survey and the sort of the trade-off between getting all the information you want and making a sort of a pleasant experience so there's the long-term pleasant experience for our visitors, and then there's the short-term experience, isn't there? And always this sort of trade-off. But first of all, I noticed, Carol, you had your hand up. Please, I beg your pardon.
That's okay. I mean, I like data because I like looking for patterns and trying to work out what it means. And the thing about the quantitative stuff is that we are not just operating in isolation, are we? We are contributing towards something which is going to be rolled up and which is going to be augmented with data from other sources. Therefore, we need that degree of consistency. And for us, it has been invaluable to know that we're part of that bigger picture and to be able to look at what else has been added and to see how that will help us interpret what we know is true of our own visitor profile and where we want to go with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I kind of get that. I love the qualitative stuff too, because it's often really insightful, but it's very difficult to roll up into anything without analysing it and trying to turn it back into the data it really isn't. And I'm interested in the boring bit. Maybe it's not boring to the people we're asking. Boring is subjective, is it really? I think for us, the biggest difficulty is that our stewards, our volunteer stewards, are very hesitant about approaching people who may just say, no, I don't want to do that.
I think that is a very interesting point. But to come back to the I do wonder whether we should challenge ourselves to make, we can still go boring, but we could do beautiful. I think there's a bit of a challenge specifically to us on our audience finder survey work, but I hear you exactly, the subjectivity of what's boring and what's not. But I think we've seen, we have a lot of experience that sort of suggests that when you make the overture in a friendly and relevant way. This is the critical thing. Why should I do this? Well, you're doing it for you, you're doing it for us, but you're also doing it for the wider community. And that's we actually did some surveying of people about surveying the ultimate cartoon, and we asked people, in fact we were particularly asking people who were seen as being usually excluded groups, because there's always this anxiety about, you know, are we making the right kind of welcome to people who normally feel excluded in our space? And so we did a lot of talking to people in all sorts of different groups who, you know, perhaps you know, experience structural inequality about these things. And all of them said, if I thought this was about making a fairer playing field and levelling up, and not levelling up in the Tory sense of it, but, you know, about better access, then I'm really up for that. I want to take part in something. So, but we need a narrative around that that explains that in an important way. And I think we need that consistency that you just spoke about, Carol, because we need to know, are the things we're doing, are they making a difference? So, you know, it's very difficult to find another way around that. Zoe.
Yeah, it was just in response actually to Natalia's comments about the over-surveying. So sorry to jump back to that theme.
No, please do.
I was just thinking about your predicament, I guess, as you were talking, and thinking actually it will come back down to the overall framework. So having that overall research framework for the year, understanding that you have got differing needs that might be in different places within the venue. But actually there is potentially ways around that. So you could be looking at inviting groups through who you might take through on a guided walk, who you might do, you know, stop and do short interviews with at different touch points within the space. And it's something that we've devised a kind of methodology around called visitor journey mapping, which can help with that. So there is ways of kind of taking people through that kind of route through a museum where, or any venue actually, where you might need to investigate or ask specific questions in relationship to, you know, it might be to the cafe, it might be to an exhibition, it might be to where you have a fundraising, you know, kind of collections box. So there could be there is a methodology to sort of stop that over surveying, but really it really does come back down to that overall framework that you need to have the oversight of at the start of the year.
Yeah, and I think it takes us back to the thing we keep coming back to, which is, you know, planning how we do our surveying so it's really tightly matched to what, not just what we need to know, but what we're going to change when we know things. You know, that actually that is the test of your plan. What will we change when we know this? And actually, what are the things we're most concerned to change? I think it's a sort of a cyclical thing, isn't it? I'm going to just stay on this last question on this frame. I hope we've touched on some of the things that everybody's talked about, but I think this thing that a lot of people have talked about, you know, this sort of this issue about the length of surveys and how long they take. And of course, if you are, say, you know, in the middle of a busy street festival and everyone's having fun and they want to go off, or you've got 15 minutes in the foyer to have a drink between a show, or, you know, or you're trying to get your kids' coats on, is that, you know, so actually this issue about length of a survey is very, very real and practical. I don't know if anyone was, you know, I think it's this again, if it's an audience finder issue, we should just point out that the audience finder core survey, the absolute minimum survey, I think takes less than 5 minutes to do. The point is that we keep adding questions in because we want to know things while we've got people. So Dan, do you have some advice to us? I know we've done a lot of testing. What is the optimum time for a survey to take? It's a silly question really, because I know they can't be, it's a trade, but what's your view?
Well, yeah, I mean, there kind of isn't an optimum time as such, but I think it depends. It's all about the context. So I think you have to think about the context. And if you know, for example, you're a cinema and you're looking to speak to people after they've watched their film, everybody's going to leave the auditorium within 3 or 4 minutes. So you probably, if you've got a questionnaire which is going to take 3 or 4 minutes to interview somebody, you're only going to be able to speak to one person with each screening. So that's probably going to take quite a long time to get that get the quantity of data that you need. So that might be an example to say, well, can we make it shorter? Even if we did make it shorter, even if we got it down to like 2 minutes, just asking like the really core must ask questions, that still doesn't really help, because that might mean we can talk to 2 people perhaps. So then it might be more about, okay, well, let's see what other methodologies are out there. And in that case, it might be better to go for some kind of an e-survey type of approach, or QR code survey, or some way where you don't have to actually engage people for the 2-3 minutes after the screening. So maybe collect people's email addresses before the screening whilst they're keen for their tickets, let them know that you're doing a research project, and they'll get an email immediately after the screening, and how useful it would be if they could respond to it, and like engage people at that point in the process, so they're much more likely to respond to that e-survey when it comes. And then on an e-survey, you've got a lot more time to play with. Again, that doesn't mean it's an excuse to ask loads of stuff you don't really need to know and make it a half-hour interview. You still want to keep it just to the stuff you need to know, but at least then you've got a little bit more wiggle room that you can easily, you can easily keep people's attention for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I know that our audience finder team that help people set up their surveys, their annual surveys, do spend quite a lot of time trying to talk people down about the number of questions they want. Sometimes the same organisation will come back, 6 months later, and go, "Why is this survey so long?" As long because but nevertheless, but and I think there's that definitely trying to weed out the questions that they are of temporary interest, because you may be able to find other ways of dealing with them. So trying to particularly things like Audience Finder, which is a long rolling annual survey, trying to build up a picture of your audience over a whole year. The thing is to try and weed out what might be, I need to know about this now, or I could find out about this by doing some spot surveying, perhaps in a different medium that might be more relevant. So, as Louise was saying, there might be sort of some social media ways of getting to know some things that you want to know about a particular audience. And I think that crops up for the person that was talking about, in the next one about the size of sample, about, you've got different constituencies that you want to be talking about. Again, trying to sort of isolate what do you want to know specifically there. Again, it all comes down to real clarity of aims, as Reece was saying, real clarity of aims, and then following through your methods and using the things that are available to you. So let's just move on quickly to frame 3, if you don't mind, Asmund, thank you. But just, quite a few people, I mean, we're used to, I think some of these, we're very used to hearing this. It's 380. A sample of that it's quite a lot. Any thoughts from anybody, indeed, about how we do get to these kind of samples that give us the confidence to know that we've got a whole population sample and that we can talk about our audiences more widely? I mean, it's a problem of statistics rather than anything else. But we had some great tips and suggestions, I thought, for how we could build up that the requisite amount of data. It's a common problem. I don't know if any of my audience finder colleagues, what do you usually tell people when this one comes up?
Sometimes it's a little bit of a psychological one, isn't it? Because you say 380, it sounds like a big scary number. That's over a year. That's 1 and a bit per day. And when you say it is 1 and a bit per day to an organisation, they go, "Oh yeah, actually that probably is realistic for us." And when you explain why the 380 is important, because it gives you that statistical significance, generally there's a kind of, yeah, okay, we get it. So I think it comes back to everything, doesn't it? It's understanding why it's important and why it's useful, and trying to do it, spreading it out across a year, not trying to do all your data collection in the last week of the financial year. Being kind of methodical about doing it. Actually, once we've had that, we're always more than happy to talk to organisations about this. But once we kind of go through a thought process with organisations, the general reaction is, "Oh, actually, this is manageable. This is less scary than I thought."
That's right. Do please bear in mind that if you are an Audience Finder user in any shape or form, you can come to us for a free in-practice session where you can just talk to you through, however that works. But yes, I should say just that comment there, like getting 280 surveys in the first place, the target from Arts Council Audience Finder, it's crazy. It's not, I mean, we all do crazy things all the time, but this particular one is to do with the statistical relevance of it rather than anything else, and only so that we can talk with some sort of confidence. Now, of course, the reality is that that's great if you're if you're a museum that has things on or open all the time. That's, yes, of course we can get one service. It is harder for smaller organisations in different situations. So again, there can be some of that question of representativeness. Sometimes if you can get a sample that's very representative of your population, you can go lower than that for the reasons that Dan laid out earlier on in the day. So just do have a chat with us about how to make that work. If you're struggling with the Audience Finder threshold, there are ways of helping you around that. Somebody's got their hand up. Natalia, hi. Tell us about numbers. Those big sample sizes, are they big or not?
So, I mean, exactly like Megan said, that's what we did, is we just divided it by the days we're open and set a target for each day of the week. And we were behind on launching the face-to-face survey. So we just launched it over 4 months ago, but we already managed to get around 57% the target. And that is simply by sharing targets with the team and being very transparent and asking the team what they wanted to see. And they were very open in saying, oh, actually, we would like to know the exact number of targets. We'd like to have it somewhere visual. We can look at it and kind of, motivate ourselves, and just kind of responding to that. And I think also kind of making it is a bit of a game, like, oh, if we can hit target 10 a day, that can motivate some members of our team.
I was going to say, do you offer prizes?
We have not offered prizes, but I will definitely bring chocolate for our team because they've been working really hard.
Or something unbiased.
Yeah, something unbiased. Yeah. But I think that could be a great idea going forward. But I think we have been, because we were so delayed due to COVID, that the motivation is simply, it's like, oh, it's the end of the financial year, we have to hit that target. And I think that is more because we're an NPO organization, so those targets are part of a slightly wider scheme. But it'd be interesting to see how we can reframe it next year, now that it will be the second year of our reopening, and hopefully COVID will be behind us.
I mean, I think that it is a bit about the mindset, isn't it? As we come on to that idea that actually if we see it as being a chore, it feels like a chore. If we see it as being this amazing resource, it becomes less of a chore. And I think that's relevant if we go on to, I'm hoping as goes the order it goes in, but on frame 4, I think we've just been talking about, well, certainly the challenges of the situation, as we've said, and this is, I think it's disingenuous not to suggest that it's much more difficult for, I think, there are some situations it's really difficult. I think that question of touring is really important. I think this, I think if you're a touring company and you are trying to share surveying with a host venue, there is no doubt that that is quite a challenge. And actually, it's one of the things that's really difficult. It's going to be very difficult for you to build up a sample that is meaningful, because actually your audiences will absolutely change. We've got so much evidence about this, will absolutely change as you go to different venues. So they will look different. So actually, even if you build up a sample of your total audience over time, it's questionable what that's telling you, because what that really is telling you is it's lots of little samples of audiences in different places. I'm not quite sure how helpful it is. So again, if you're a touring company, it depends where you're touring, what you're trying to find out about. We leave aside what our stakeholders ask us for, but we think about what really matters to us and our audiences. I would really encourage you to have a chat with us about what you're trying to achieve, because there are all sorts of ways of thinking about it. And those and they are similar from being outdoor. We do have a lot of examples of organisations who've been really successful at doing outdoor arts, street arts, and getting really mind-blowingly changing data from their audiences, not least because, of course, we've discovered that through using standard frameworks and that consistency, we've discovered just how brilliantly good outdoor arts are at attracting quite a different audience. So it's really worth it. And that having a little bit of evidence at your finger as an outdoor arts organisation can be incredibly powerful in terms of bringing in other forms of investment and getting the stakeholders on side that you need. But I would say, and that's a bit of a catch-all. If we had longer, I actually would like to take apart some of those pieces, but do talk to us. There are ways around it. It's all about this design of what is it you really want to know. How do we try and use the resources at our fingertips to do it? So moving on to 5, Adam. We talked about the limited resources. I'm very interested if anybody's got, I know a lot of you are working with volunteers, the people that put that in there, relying on, I'm one step removed, I'm relying on volunteers, I'm working part-time. Time is a big issue for people. I don't know if anyone's got any suggestions. Alice from Applause. Yes, thank you. I was wondering about incentivising volunteers. I understand that we have to be careful not to appear like payment. Any advice? Well, I was going to ask you. I think if you I don't know if any of our panel plus, but those of you who are working a lot with volunteers, any thoughts? It feels as though, I think that one of the things I know, I'm playing for time, please do volunteer. One of the things I know is that you know, that when we do those volunteer training things, that I think volunteers don't always understand what an important job it is and how they are the face of the organisation. Sometimes that is very motivating in itself. Although personally, I feel that bribery of the right kind, as you say, is all right. Are there? I mean, are there? Alice, I don't know this. Are there rules about what you can and can't do that does look like payment? I'm not aware enough. Any thoughts on volunteering, anyone? Who's that got their hand up? Talk to me, Natalia. Yes.
So even though we don't use volunteers to carry out the audience finder survey anymore, this is just from kind of my experience of working with volunteers in our front of house teams. So the main important point is that from speaking to our volunteers, that they feel valued and that they feel like their time there is actually useful to the organisation. Because again, another challenge due to COVID has been when volunteers turn up and it's a very quiet day and they don't actually get to engage with visitors, then they feel like, oh, am I doing my role correctly? Or is this kind of as rewarding as they thought it would be? So I think that would be important, is to ensure that they are engaging with visitors and that it's starting a conversation. I mean, if they're front of house volunteers in particular, rather than simply collecting, you know, hard data. But then there's also like the one side to that is, sometimes and I've had this before, is when you start a conversation with somebody and they start telling you the feedback, but then they have to input it into the tablet, you know, so is a two-way kind of street with that.
And I was going to say, Zoe, I don't know if you've got any thoughts about this, because I know you do quite a lot of working with volunteers frontline and training and so on as well, but it feels as though, and this is the same whether it's volunteers or paid staff or whoever, but it feels as though if you understand the whole cycle, in particular, what has changed through surveying? I think this comes back to some of the bigger questions around impact and organisational issues that we might not get onto this afternoon. But this understanding, what changed because I stood there and asked every 10th person on a drafty night, whatever. I filled in a survey and look, I can see you have fed back to me what you changed as a result of that. And I think that very actively promoting the changes that we make on the basis of the feedback that we get is all part of the really, the cycle of value that we can create.
That feedback loop is incredibly important. I think it also comes down to the recruitment techniques that you use for volunteers, and actually being really explicit from the offset. So, actually, if you are recruiting a pool of volunteers, to make it something that is a role type that you might be looking for. And I think certainly what I've worked with on some of the projects that I've been working with on evaluation with over the past few years, they've actively sought people who feel comfortable doing that. And they might be people who have been studying and might just want to get some additional skills potentially in being a researcher, things like that. So quite often you'll get people coming to the forefront who are kind of feel fairly happy fulfilling that role. Although I have found that you do need to continue to recruit, because quite often they'll come and do it for a shortish period before they kind of go on to do something else.
Dan?
Yeah, just definitely following on from what Zoe's just said. I think we shouldn't forget that like interviewing and being a researcher on the ground isn't an easy job, and it isn't necessarily something that everybody's inclined to do or necessarily has any interest in doing. So I think it's important to be really upfront that part of the role is doing interviews, making that really clear upfront, rather than it being you're also going to have to do some interviews. It's kind of like, it's a really core part of the role. And it might make sense to say, I know when we're working with the wave makers for Galway 2020, they had a really engaged bunch of volunteers they're working with. Some of them expressed an interest in research and audience development and having that role in the process. Others were more interested in stewarding or spreading the word of the European Capital of Culture in their local communities. So I think they actively said to volunteers, like, we've got these different roles, which role would you be most interested in? And they made sure that those who expressed an interest had the training and support and the feedback to make that role really valuable to them.
Yeah, and part of the welcome. Andy.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, I mean, we talk about we're implying or inferring that, this is all based on sort of person-to-person interviews going through the survey. I had a question. I'm not sure whether it made it to the mood board or not, the Jamboard. We do a lot of surveying. We have done for many years working with Audience Finder. And we do sort of, I think it's called facilitated self-survey. So we wander through the galleries and hand out surveys on paper surveys on a clipboard saying, would you mind filling in this short survey at some stage during your visit and give it back to us before you leave? And that's very successful. And I think it's possibly also overcome some of the volunteers' reluctance to stand there and interview if all they have to do is say, would you mind filling in this short survey and handing it back to us before you leave?
Yeah.
I wondered whether that was any...
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not assuming that everything is totally like a very expensive. I won't mention any famous well-known brand names that you stand there and ask all the questions. But I think that's right. I think that can work really well. And I think particularly if that's important scripting that says why we'd like you to do this and why it's important to us, but you can still do that, can't you? Without having to hover over people with their every word. Yeah, absolutely. Dan, would you I think that's a good...
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important part, the most valuable thing that that an interviewer, however whatever their exact role is, I think the most important thing that a human in that position can do is make that approach and say, hi, we're having a conversation with our visitors, or we want to know what you think. And that human invite, I think that's the most important part of the whole thing. Whether the step after that is they then complete their own paper questionnaire, or load a survey on their smartphones, or are asked a series of questions by the interviewer, or whatever it is, I think that approach is like the fundamental thing, which is going to encourage all visitors to feel like they can take part. So absolutely no problems at all with doing assisted self-completion. I think as long as the tool is completable without the support of a researcher there helping guide people through the weirdly worded questions and stuff, then I think that as long as you get the approach in, then it's all good.
I'm particularly loving Louise's suggestion. Stickers, come on, who doesn't like them? I think adults like them more than kids do these days, because the kids are all too wise to it. It's a brilliant point. Thank you. Megan, what are you going to add to that?
Sorry, yeah, just quickly going back to volunteers, I was reminded of a conversation I had with an organisation quite recently who said, gosh, we're concerned that our volunteers aren't collecting many surveys. What can we think we've tried everything, what can we do? And it turned out they then went and had a conversation with their admittedly very small volunteer team and said, what is making you anxious? Very honest conversation. What is your anxiety, specific anxiety around approaching people and asking for surveys? And the thing that came back surprised them and surprised, me as well. And apparently it was about data protection. The volunteers just didn't feel comfortable that this data was going to be looked after securely. So actually we then set up a session with that organisation and with their volunteers where we talked through the data agreement we have with that organisation and what we do with the data and what responsibility the organisation has versus what the audience agency does. And at the end of that, everyone just seemed to be much more reassured.
I think that's super useful, and I suspect that there are other people inside our organisations who feel the same way. So that actually everyone's a bit suspicious. What is this surveying thing for? I don't like the look of it. Somebody's doing it somewhere. It's just because the Arts Council wants it. So that full buy-in for the organisation valuing it more widely, I think it's really interesting. Andy, were you going to add or ask anything else about that?
No, I mean, it was just...
As a very experienced researcher, I know, yes.
It was just I was just thinking about, I think it was Dan saying that, if you're actually trying to get a number of surveys in as people are leaving a performance, because, leaving the survey on the seat doesn't really yield that much. Actually, if you can hand out 20 surveys to people when they're leaving, rather than standing and just talking to one person for 4 minutes. So, and there's a volume thing there as well.
Yeah, totally. And it is the single biggest, it's such a hygiene thing, but it's the single biggest thing that people struggle with, as we've said, particularly in less obvious situations than kind of nice throughput of regular visitors and so on. It can be really challenging. So no, I really welcome that. I think that's these sort of pragmatic workarounds. I think understanding the principles of what you're trying to do really helps you to find the pragmatic workaround, doesn't it? And I think that's feeling confident to make it work for you sounds right. I just wanted to mention very quickly that the young people thing that quite a few people mentioned is an important one, though, because this is a less easy workaround, I think it is fair to say, because there are just ethical and legal issues around surveying people under 16. And I think there is no doubt that this is really problematic if a majority or a very significant portion of your work and impact is around young people. These kinds of audience finder and indeed just general surveying is not actually open to you. So I think I don't know if anybody, I think it's something that we really need to acknowledge. Personally, I think we do need to find ways of having conversations with our stakeholders in which we can acknowledge that is a large part of what we do. And I'm certainly quite interested to talk to people about other ways in which we could have that conversation with funders and stakeholders about how we signal that contribution in different ways. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts. I mean, Dan, would you want to just tell us quickly about the legal situation on under 16s?
Yeah, so the Market Research Society's position is don't do research with under 16s, or don't do kind of general research with under 16s. So that's the basis on which, whenever we're doing surveying work, whenever we're describing an audience, we're always very clear that that audience is the 16 and over audience. So you absolutely can collect data from people under the age of 16. I think there are actually different thresholds at different age bands, but the simplest and safest thing with the MRS approach is 16 or over, or under. Those are the two groups. So with under 16s, you can collect data. It just requires consent of a parental guardian or responsible adult at that point, and that consent has to be actively sought and recorded and attached to the young person's response. So it definitely is a more administratively complex process, and I think it's just being aware of that. I think we could probably do a whole session on the ins and outs of.
We could, and I'm very happy to. So please signal it as one of the things you might be interested in. But I think it's worth saying. So there's again, it's like, can you get what you want to know from talking to teachers? Can you get what you need to know from talking to parents? And if you can't, you can, of course, do very well, carefully managed and carefully designed work, particularly qualitatively, perhaps, because that might give you what you really need to know. And that is about what you as an organisation might need to know about your young people's audiences. I think there's this other question about how we could, how we could just have a conversation, particularly with the Arts Council as a funder. I mean, of course, they're fully aware of this. But it's like, how else can we make sure that people's contribution, it's not a level playing field when it comes to these different ways of representing our impact? So I'm quite keen to do that, and I'm seeing, thank you, not lots of nice enthusiastic encouragement to perhaps do something dedicated to that. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because at this point we were supposed to be doing a Mentimeter where I was going to ask you about what other forms of support and resources would be interesting to you, but it's been such a great conversation that I haven't wanted to stop and go on to do that. So if there are things, so resources, areas of interest, when I talk about support, I don't just mean how-tos, I also mean, are there things that we could do to make you feel more represented in the way that you're doing your work? So I would really encourage you, do drop us anything in the chat. I'm going to spend the last few minutes just talking about something really important. So Adam, would you mind just going back to the Jamboard for me? I know I'm jumping all over the place and confusing you here, but I just wanted to come on to that question about young people seemed to me very important, but also there's the other question, which I don't want to, there's some methodological things which you've raised, which we would definitely be able to cover off and talk about in the resource that we're planning. But I wanted to just move on to, I think it's frame 6 or 7, the audience finder specific. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. We will take that on board. And the next one is, and I think that's a very broad conversation that I would like to come back to at some point philosophically, but I'm looking for the next one maybe, and the next one. Good. Diversity challenges and the challenges of representativeness. So this is obviously a big one, and this is a conversation that we come back to all the time in our work. So I just wanted to flag the fact that we are working on 2 resources at the moment which are really specific here. One we're calling the Anti-Racist Research Guidelines working title, and the other one is the Accessible Research guidelines, which are both about thinking to do with issues, these issues of diversity, how we talk about identity, and indeed how we fairly and unbiasedly survey around, particularly with groups of people who are from structurally disadvantaged parts of society, but also just the issues around race, identity, and disability, because they do raise all sorts of challenges for us. So just to say there is work in hand, I think these are really important points to raise. There is just a single problem in as much as, you know, with smaller sections of the community, you do need to have larger samples to find true representativeness, but there is a lot we can do, as you have suggested here, around making sure that we minimize the amount of bias, not just as in ourselves as individuals, but that we have, you know, our interviewers, the people that are involved with doing the work itself, with making the invitation itself, that they look as diverse as the audiences that we want to get feedback from. So I just want to raise the fact that we're not sidestepping this. There will be some stuff in the resource about this, and there will be some more resources to help us have this conversation. I just didn't want to sidestep it and not talk about that at all. So I think we are now close to the end of our session. So I just want to very quickly just finish up with talking about what happens next. You know, just those very important points there that you've raised. So there will be some more on that. So let me just, I think I need to screen share again. Let me just do that for the finally. Where am I? Where have we come up? Apologies. Last point at which you wanted to be waiting. So just to finish off really, yes, I had some questions for you in a Mentimeter, which you've missed out on doing. I'm terribly sorry to say. Just asking you what, as you know, what other kinds of resources would be useful. Do please keep in touch with us and tell us. There is a little feedback survey here, but it's quite quick. And of course, please do it. It'll be posted into the chat in a moment, I think, Adam, won't it? But so just to follow up, I really say that we are going to be sending you this practical guide to surveying as people who've taken part in this session and have been really helpful to helping us to think through what else should go in there. We would love your feedback on it. So when it comes, please don't think that's a one-way traffic. Do give some feedback. As I say, coming soon, working titles, we will be consulting over and putting out drafts of the anti-racist research resource and the accessible research resource. The anti-racist one's coming out first. We're just working on a last draft of that. And again, many of the things that you've talked about and raised today will be informing our thinking on that. Various of my colleagues have mentioned that if you would like a training session for your colleagues, that is a service that we offer. That's both for volunteers and for staff. You know, just in case that might be useful. We hope that we've given you enough to take that on yourselves if you have the time and appetite for doing that. Meanwhile, though, do please keep in touch with us. We do have a nice the audience agency community, which you can find from our website, where all sorts of questions of this type, from, you know, how many things do I, you know, how many people do I need for a representative sample, to has anyone got some examples of incentives I can use in my volunteers? All those questions are very, very ripe and correct for use on the community. Am I right, Megan? Megan's always putting all those sorts of great questions. We might even post some of your questions with your permission on there, or versions of that other people might like to answer. If you want to just be kept in touch with when these new resources and training things, maybe something for young people is coming out next, do subscribe to our newsletter if you don't already, because that way you will get to find out about it. And please fill in our evaluation. And it only remains for me to say that for those of you who've stayed the course magnificently, thank you all so much. It's been really, really useful and interesting for us. Please do, let's keep having this conversation. There is, as we've already seen, so much more to be said. So thank you to our three speakers. Very kind of you to come. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Natalia. And thank you very much, Reese. And thank you all for attending. See you soon.